CD4.
Chapter 3. To begin with, naturally, they had been absolutely necessary to one another, because of the strangeness of the shipboard life and of their fellow passengers. Each had been the other's only refuge, and Miss Hartshorn had felt her own responsibility keenly. They had shared a cabin, they had eaten quietly together, they had sat out on deck through the hot days and late into the beautiful star-filled evenings, reading aloud from Miss Hartshorn's books, discussing poetry and drama and prose, ideas and images. They had done crossword puzzles and played elaborate games of patience and walked up and down, and Miss Hartshorn had talked. Kitty had not allowed herself to think, to dwell on home and the past, or to speculate about the future and the enormity of what she was doing. But after a week of restless, cramped nights in the close, dark little cabin, perhaps even less than a week, she had grown restless, had looked away from the books, and up and about her, wandered off alone sometimes, had hidden on the far side of the ship and leaned on the rail and watched the flying fish soar past like flights of silver arrows, catching the sun, and felt by turn tremendous energy and surges of excitement, so that she thought she might have leaped up like the fish and touched the sun, and fear, terrible fear, that threatened to obliterate her. On the 8th day she had asked for a cabin of her own, but there was not one, of course, to spare, so that instead she had had a mattress and blanket brought up on deck and slept out through the tropics, in defiance of Miss Hartshorn. It was not until much later, on reaching the Mediterranean, that the sudden coldness at night had driven her back below. On the 10th day, the young officer, whose name was Hartley Hanson Kay, had come to stand beside her at the rail, and after a while invited her to play a game of deck quoits. And perhaps Kitty had liked him, or perhaps she had not, but either way she had enjoyed herself hugely, hurled herself into game after game, and others had joined them from among the younger passengers, junior civil servants, young wives. There had been boisterousness and laughter. Later they had sat on deck chairs, Kitty and Hartley Hanson Kay, talking a little, laughing at rather feeble jokes. Miss Hartshorn, finding them there, had intervened at once, had taken Kitty down to the cabin, admonished, warned, reproved. "You are not yet even 16, she had said, over and over again, "and you are in my charge, my care. I am solely responsible until we arrive in England." But after that, at the quayside, one presumed her responsibilities would be over. She would hand Kitty over, and that would be the end of it. She resented that, resented the whole matter of the cousin and the arrangements for Cambridge which had been made behind her back. That evening she had gone up alone and spoken to several passengers, and finally to the young man, who was amiable and pliable and stupid enough, and wanted no trouble, certainly, and so, the next day, had ignored Kitty, and kept to the other side of the ship entirely, among his own crowd. Kitty felt bewilderment, and a profound sense of injustice, as well, perhaps, as a certain relief. Thought fiercely, standing once again quite alone, that she had not come all this way, had not left her home merely to find the company of some young man attractive. She burned with a hunger for learning, real learning, far above Miss Amelia Hartshorn's little books, for knowledge and the desire to do good, so that the time was exactly ripe for the meeting which took place by chance the following day with Miss Lovelady. "A missionary," Amelia Hartshorn had said, dismissing the woman with the grey hair rolled up like a tight fat pincushion at her neck. Not that she herself was irreligious. Only she had picked up on the voyage out to India a certain knowledge of the hierarchy of the ship, the unwritten code which was the guide to how things were done. Missionaries were not regarded. If they travelled together, they kept together. Travelling alone, they were left alone, which was to say, shunned. Not that she had anything against missionaries. for governesses, she was aware, came scarcely any higher up in the order of things.
A missionary? A Scots person, I dare say?
Though Miss Lovelady was not. And so the little dumpy woman had passed by and out of sight, and they had gone on with their reading of Swinburne. And then there had been the incident over the young man, Hartley Hanson Kay. The following day the weather had worsened after the progression of so many calm, still days and nights. There was a storm, discomforting, though not particularly serious, and Kitty had felt exhilarated by it. The rough sea and the wind, the turbulence, matched her own mood. But Miss Hartshorn was prostrated. She lay on a bunk in the cabin and was scarcely able to raise her head from the appalling seasickness. She had no energy left at all to attend to Kitty, was barely even aware of her existence. So Kitty went up on deck, thrilled by the rolling, boiling sea, and the wind whipped her hair into her face, and she tasted salt on her lips, and felt that she might sing and dance and shout with exhilaration. It was as though she were riding the ship, and her own body was part of the wild movements. After a moment or two, she became aware that the little dumpy woman, the missionary, was on deck too, standing with her face turned upwards to the rain and the blown spray, wrapped from head to foot in a long mackintosh cape, like a grey cloud billowing up and around her. They smiled at one another, but words were shouted, yelled out, yet still went unheard above the din. In the end, exhausted, they were obliged to retreat, and then, naturally, came together to talk in a corner of the passenger lounge, which was entirely empty, and the woman, who was a missionary, introduced herself as Editha Lovelady, and so the friendship was begun. For the next 3 days they became inseparable, though for 2 hours every afternoon Miss Lovelady rested in her cabin, and then Kitty wandered about disconsolately, picked up a book and did not read it, stared at the water, thought about their conversations. And Miss Lovelady retired quite early to bed. She had been seriously ill. It was a heart condition that obliged her to return home earlier than she had ever planned from the missionary field. Indeed, she had never planned to return at all.
I would have hoped to remain there, to die in India. That has been home. There is no other. And I am only 62. I dare say that seems very old to you. So old. But I could have worked for, another 10 years at least. I feel I am still needed, that I have something left to give. But we do not always choose, Kitty, and I have accepted it.
Though there was nothing left for her in England. She had been one of only 2 daughters of a clerical family, but they were all dead, and there were no relatives, none at all. There was just the house, let for years but empty again now. It was to the house in Norfolk that she would go.
And you are to be with your cousin in Cambridge, and that is not so very far away. Perhaps our paths may cross again.
They sat in Miss Lovelady's cabin. It was early evening. Miss Hartshorn was still prostrated.
I love it here. It is like a little sitting room, like a home.
There were beaded cushions and brass ornaments neatly set out, and an Indian spread over the plain ship's blankets. There was a little canvas stool and an embroidery frame, a crucifix on a stand with a religious picture beside, rows of books, and a little spirit stove on which Miss Lovelady had made tea, and a fruit cake and shortbread in tins. All through the late afternoon and evening, and again in the morning, walking out on deck or when the weather calmed, sitting there once again, they had talked. Kitty had talked about home and her childhood, and about herself, her plans, feelings, longings, bewilderments, desires. She had told stories about the friends in Calcutta and life at the club, and poured out her anger at the cruelties of India. She had never talked so much, or so intimately, never wished to do so before. And Miss Lovelady had listened, and nodded, and sometimes spoken, but mostly let her have her head, and only sat sewing. Books had been discussed, too, taken down and rifled through. but it was not like the lessons with Miss Hartshorn.
Have you read Pilgrim's Progress? Do you know Stevenson? Kidnapped? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? I feel you would so enjoy something that stirs the blood. Such storytelling. And then you should be ready for Dickens now. You have such a passionate heart, Kitty, such a sense of injustice. You would find so much fuel for your righteous indignation in the pages of Dickens. Oh, and such vigour and humour, such life.
But several times a day she had admonished Kitty to return to Miss Hartshorn.
She may need something, or else just want your company. She may be feeling a little better now that the storm has subsided. You must be sure to attend to her, Kitty.
For Miss Lovelady was strict in her sense of duty, and Kitty was not to be indulged. But Miss Hartshorn lay drained and weak after the appalling bouts of sickness, and wanted nothing, though she resented the presence of Miss Lovelady and the holds she had on the girl's attention. She would have liked Kitty here in the cabin, quietly sitting, but did not know how to insist. Miss Lovelady had cards. She taught Kitty the game of piquet, and then they played engrossed for hours, at the same time listening to operetta and the music of military bands on an old wind-up gramophone. She talked only a very little of her own life in India, the country in which she had lived and worked for 32 years. There had been long spells at various mission stations, in the hills and very remote places. She had loved it completely and unreservedly, had never had a day's unhappiness. She had loved everything about the country, the people, the life. She would never see it again. The pain of that thought was the greatest she had ever had to bear. She could not bear it, and so it was easier not to think, not to speak.
I should be interested to see the house in Norfolk again, she said. We spent holidays there when I was a child. I wonder if I remember it aright.
And looked at Kitty across the cabin, and Kitty seemed to her to shine like an angel, all innocence and hope.
And you have everything before you?
Kitty looked up, hearing the note in her voice, and smiled, but did not, of course, fully understand. Only that night for a long time she could not sleep, but lay aware of the gentle motion of the ship, and thought of Miss Lovelady and how it must be for her, and perhaps realized then the extent of her loneliness. And she herself seemed to be looking from some great height at her own future life, which was spread out like a new country below her. She felt herself, and yet not herself at all, and then thought quite calmly of home, and saw that too, as if it were a picture being unrolled, saw the house, the gardens, and the fountains arching up and over and against the immaculate sky, her mother walking elegantly, and she was suspended here between them, and had no part in any of it, but she was perfectly calm, perfectly content. The ship creaked and settled within itself, sailing on. In the opposite bunk, Miss Hartshorn, still weak, her limbs aching, thought of nothing at all. Kitty slept. And in her sleep, in her dreams, Edita Lovelady wandered about the house in Norfolk, went from room to room without faltering, and found that she remembered it all perfectly, and in every detail. It was simply as it had always been, and nothing was forgotten. The grittiness of the sand on the floor of the hall, and the soft pale mounds of it pushed into the crevices of her shoes as she slipped them on, and the muddle of nets and walking sticks and rackets half-propped, half-fallen over in the green-painted porch. As she moved about the house, she opened windows to let in the sunlight and the sea air, for although she was alone, in her dream they were all expected. Everyone was coming down. She took down books from shelves, old faded storybooks, and banged them, but there was scarcely any dust. There had never been dust here. Beyond the windows, the short front garden and the path that led onto the lane, and the lane that led down to the flat shingle, pale pebbles stretching all the way to the rim of the sea. The smell of the sea, and the seashore. Pungent salt came to her nostrils. On the sandy patch of front lawn, a solitary grey plover, running, stopping, making its little low whistle. But it seemed in her dream that she waited alone in the house for hours, going from room to empty room, and that no one came after all, and the tide lay far out, and she knew no way of reaching it. In corners and cracks, spiders' webs, and the nests of tiny mice. And when she touched a curtain to draw it back, the faded fabric fell apart, soft as a cloud of powder in her hand. Waking the following morning, Miss Hartshorn felt better, able to sit up and wash and perhaps even eat a little breakfast. Later, she might dress and sit in the chair, so that Kitty was obliged to remain with her, to talk and ring for tea and tidy the cabin a little. Beyond the porthole, sky and sea were limpid blue with scarcely a blur between. But at 11 o'clock she was able to escape, for Miss Hartshorn was very weak after all. She must lie down again on her bunk and rest, though the sickness had gone. There was a good deal of activity on the ship, people about on deck to enjoy the air again, for it was warm now, a calm spring sunshine. But the passage that led to Miss Lovelady's cabin was quite silent, quite deserted, and when Kitty walked down it, a steward barred her way. For Miss Lovelady was dead, had died in her sleep, in her dreams of wandering from room to room of the house in Norfolk. Kitty stumbled back up the iron staircase and stood on the deck, staring blindly at the unbroken surface of the sea. In India there had always been death, casual death, anywhere, all around her. She had lived with it, grown up with it, and it had scarcely touched her. Eleanor had visited the woman with the dead baby, and there had been other women, with other children, dead of some sudden sickness. A friend at the club had died of smallpox, and father's clerk had fallen down dead of apoplexy. There were bodies sometimes in the ditches, on the streets, and the wailing from funerals and the smoke from the pyres hanging acrid on the hot air, and sometimes the bodies were removed, and sometimes they rotted. But still it had never truly touched her, never caused her heart to falter in its beating. Its chill had never rested upon her. Edita Lovelady had been her friend for 4 days. She had found her by chance, and yet by choice too, for and by herself, the closest in the world. She had told truths, welcomed Kitty and her confidences, yet somehow kept at a distance from them, had respected her. She had made Kitty begin to recognize and understand her own self. In so far as it was possible, Kitty had even loved her. And all the doors she had opened still stood so, giving onto new rooms, new worlds. But she herself was dead, and they would never talk again. An image of the dumpy body, of the pincushion of grey streaked hair lying still and stiff on the bunk. Was she on the bunk? Was she still in the cabin at all? Stood between Kitty and the view before her. And Miss Lovelady had been alone, entirely alone. I would have wanted to die there in India, but we cannot choose. Kitty began to shake, so that she was forced to hold her hands together tightly until the bones cracked. She felt terribly afraid, as though she herself might dissolve and disintegrate. People sat or stood at the rail in pairs and little groups, murmuring. People knew, but no one looked at her. No one spoke. "What will happen? Oh, what will happen?" She wanted to cry out to someone, but only stood, her throat constricted, and could not move one step or speak at all. What will happen to her? For she had not the least idea. It was all over rather quickly. It seemed that the death had scarcely been discovered than it was dealt with, for it caused a shadow to fall across the ship. It discomforted them. It was best got out of the way. Miss Hartshorn did not feel able to attend, and would have prevented Kitty, but did not know how, felt helpless, weak, afraid, perhaps. The funeral was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. People kept away on the other side of the ship out of respect or embarrassment, and because a death, an unexpected shocking death, is an intrusion, it casts a shadow. But a few gathered, officials, the chief steward, the chaplain, black as a crow, and another missionary, and Mrs. Fanshawe with her mother appearing from somewhere. They had never spoken to Miss Lovelady, nor even been aware of her, only, hearing of her death, it seemed a duty to attend. Kitty stood apart and alone in the sunshine, and her mouth felt cracked and dry. She was terribly afraid, thought that she might faint, but did not. The ship's engine was stilled. Somewhere below, a small child crying. We therefore commit her body to the deep to be turned into corruption, looking for the resurrection of the body, when the sea shall give up its dead, and the life of the world to come through our Lord Jesus Christ.
No,
she would have cried out.
Oh, no, no.
Wanted to lunge forward and somehow hold back the grey bundle, for the sight of it filled her with horror and dread and anger, a terrible anger.
No, I am here. You shan't go. You are not alone. They must not. No.
But she did not speak or move, and Miss Lovelady, shrouded, quite alone, slipped over the side and was gone, and the ship scarcely paused, scarcely faltered in its step. The smooth surface of the water was scarcely broken. The sun went on palely shining. In the night Kitty awoke, trembling, and in the end got up and went out into the cool, still night, and stood in a corner of the deck.
Who am I?
She thought in panic.
Who am I?
For it seemed sure that she was no longer the person she had always been, the familiar child. Death had touched her and changed her forever. It had awakened her irrevocably to the knowledge of mortality, her own most of all.
I will die,
she thought over and over again.
I will die.
She touched her own flesh for reassurance, but received none. And the vision of Miss Lovelady's grey body slipping into the water remained before her eyes and would not fade. She felt loss and grief, and all the things she might have spoken of, or might have asked and told the dumpy woman in her crowded, reassuring cabin, swirled about like a snowstorm inside her head, and would not settle. Most of all, she would have told how she felt now. The fear, the anger, the sense of betrayal. Most of all, she felt infinitely betrayed, but did not know by what, by whom. Above her head, the night sky was clouded. There were no stars. In the cabin, undisturbed, Miss Hartshorn slept. Chapter 4. Dressing to go out, for it is her 41st birthday, they are to dine at the club, Eleanor holds up a scarf of crimson tulle, and for a second it veils the light, and she sees the world as rose-coloured, softened, comforting, and is reminded of some scene from the past, from deepest childhood, and a rose-red shade or curtain drawn against the light, and her mother coming in to soothe her. And is Kitty reminded, and in some such chance and casual way, of her? But the scarf falls, floats down onto her open palm, and rests there, and it is too hot for the late afternoon. The weather has changed. She thinks wearily of all the business of getting ready for the move to the hills. Chapter 5. But India might never have existed, except in dreams. And the afternoon darkened to evening and night, and a light drizzle began to fall. But still Kitty stood on deck, watching, waiting. And Miss Hartshorn waited too, but did not watch, only stared at the floor, alone in the cabin, surrounded by boxes and cases, packed and strapped. Then the door blowing suddenly open brought in the smell of rain and river and docks, of home, and she was filled with joy and then dread, but still she wanted to jump up and go and join Kitty on the deck and embrace her and stand watching with her, but did not. In Miss Lovelady's locked cabin, all the things that had belonged to her, the remains of her existence, waited for no one and were of no significance now. "What will happen to them? Whose are they?" Kitty would have asked, and she thought, ridiculously, of the fruit-cake and the fingers of shortbread in their tins, and the row of brown sensible shoes, but she could not bring herself to speak about any of it, and whoever would know? And the house in Norfolk waited too, windows tightly closed, yet the spring gales battered at them and loosened the locks, and inside the floorboards moved, curtains shifted, and then stillness and silence again, and the empty rooms waited. But for whom? For what? Kitty's eyes smarted with tiredness and watching. Her body felt cramped and stiff, but she could only be taut, alert. It was not possible to relax. On the quayside, the lamps shone fuzzily here and there through halos of rain, and gleamed in pools on the ground. There was the usual clangour as the great ship edged in. Florence stood under a corrugated metal overhang, sheltering from the rain and the bitter wind, and waited alone for Kitty. For there had been a moment when she had allowed herself to look the likely truth of things full in the face, and acknowledge it absolutely, like pulling aside a curtain and staring just once straight into a mirror before drawing back. The truth was that he would not marry her, that he had no interest in her at all, but nor had he in any other woman. He would never marry. She might take comfort from that. She might plot and determine, but her own wants counted for nothing and had no power. He would avoid speaking to her, encountering her in any way if he could. And suddenly the frustration of it had worn her down, though as soon as she had glimpsed and admitted the truth she had turned aside and could not bear it. She allowed new hope to flicker up from somewhere, and cupped her hands around it tenderly, shielding it like a weak and fitful flame. Well, but at least she had a status. She had been a married woman. When she looked at the other women about her in their society, that too was a comfort. So she had determined to throw herself completely into the business of looking after Eleanor's child, and planning out her education, for she had surely some maternal instinct which would serve. And so, for several weeks, she had gone energetically about. Letters had been written, visits made. There were to be classes on certain mornings, poetry and other literature with Miss Bell at her cottage in Jesus Lane, art appreciation, and some mathematics and natural history, and Thea Pontifex had been approached about finding a tutor for history. Then she supposed religious studies, about which surely it would be perfectly in order to consult him. There must be visits to London, too, to the museums and the galleries, perhaps even, from time to time, to suitable plays. She will want more than that. Young girls do nowadays. She ought to be sent to a proper school. She will need to mix with friends of her own age. It is all very different from when you were young. So said old Mrs. Gray, but was not particularly attended to. The room was got ready, a very nice room. Georgiana had said so. It was at the top of the house, long and low, with a window at either end. They had chosen pretty new curtains and a wallpaper. There were painted bookcases and a small armchair, and the chimney had been swept out to allow a fire to be burned in the grate again. Beyond the windows, the backs, the meadows, the river, and on the other side all the rooftops of Cambridge and the great college tower, whose bells would tumble her awake. And a mirror on the dressing-room table, and a desk and chair, and new quilted cover on the bed. It is what this house has lacked, Florence thought, looking round at last. Young footsteps on the stairs, a lighter, brighter voice, energy, interest, eagerness. It is what I have needed, for she had never had anyone but her mother to care for or to take trouble over. She will bring a breath of fresh air into our dreary lives. Chapter 6. The wind blew great gales marauding across the bare land. Branches of trees snapped off and whirled away. Out on the fens the birds fled or hid, huddled, and were battered about. And with the wind came rain, and where a slate had blown off the roof of Miss Lovelady's house in Norfolk, the rain drove in like nails, and seeped through the ceiling, gradually staining a circle, and ran in a channel down the scullery gutter, and drip, drip, dripped steadily onto the yard. But who was to know or care? What had it to do with anyone at all? Crossing the gardens late in the afternoon under a scudding sky, Thomas Cavendish saw, because his head was bent, aconites, yellow as butter, and a clot of snowdrops on fragile stems, pale beneath the branches of the copper beech, and on the grassy rise close to the hedge, and stopped, his coat flapping in the wind, and looked down with sudden pleasure at the first faint marks of spring. On the table in his rooms, a private letter from Jonas Daubeny, the college dean. The hotel was rather dark, with heavy oak furniture and lace curtains thick as curd cheese, and drapes and covers and cloths of maroon-coloured plush. People spoke in low voices or not at all, only sat staring into the fire or turning the pages of newspapers. Kitty was pale, almost silent, tired. Beyond the windows in the darkness it rained, a chill, thin rain. She could not believe it was possible for India to exist. But the dinner was good, plain and hot and substantial, and Florence encouraged her to drink a little wine. "It will all seem much better in the morning, not so strange, and you will feel fresh again." She looks like a child, she thought, is a child, among so many dull elderly people, and felt sorry for her, and reached across to press her hand. Kitty smiled, pushed apple pudding onto her spoon, thought, "Who am I? What am I doing here?" and glanced round the stuffy little room in panic, searching for something familiar, recognizable, to comfort her, and unexpectedly found it in the sight of a small brass gong, embossed with figures and a frieze of animals around the base of the stand. "Oh, everyone has those," she said to Florence. "They are always on the sideboard in our houses in India." But then, trying to swallow the food, she could not, because the tears spurted up into her eyes, her nostrils, her throat. They filled her mouth and threatened to choke her. Calmly, gently, Florence led her out. It had been a long walk, longer than Georgiana had anticipated, out to the old hospital. If she had realized, she would have called a cab. Only she supposed that the exercise would have done her good, except that the wind had beaten her about the head, pushing against it had exhausted her completely, so that, arriving in the cold, dark entrance hall, she had been obliged to sit down for several minutes on a wooden bench. She was wet, too. The wind had driven rain into her face all the way. She sat listening to footsteps echoing sharply down the tiled corridors, and the sound of wailing and the incessant coughs. Nowhere, Georgiana thought suddenly, nowhere should be like this, so dark, so bleak, so chill. The faces she saw were hard, preoccupied, closed. They had dead eyes. And then eventually, on reaching the ward, she was told simply that Mary Dundas was dead since the previous day. Mary, who had been their housemaid all those years ago, until she had grown lame and wayward and unreliable, so that they had been obliged to let her go. And where had she gone? Georgiana thought now. And the truth was that she had never known, never inquired where, had perhaps not wished to be told. After quite a short time, Mary Dundas had been all but forgotten, but last week the letter had come that she was old and very ill, dying even, in this hospital, and had asked if she might see Miss Cavendish. And now Georgiana had come at last, and sat in shame and distress on a hard chair in a cold corridor outside the door of the ward, and all around her the wails, the cries, the moaning, and the brisk, impersonal footsteps. Mary Dundas was dead. Were they relatives? Friends? A later employer? She did not know, could not ask. No one should die in such a place as this, in this way, she thought, and gripped her hands tightly on the sides of the chair. But how could she have prevented it? What could she have done? Somewhere a bell rang and then fell silent, and after that, for a few moments, there was only the sound of the rain pattering against the uncurtained windows and onto the skylight above her head. Lamps were lit and glowed in the corners of the room. The fire burned rich red at the deep heart of the coals. The Dean's face was scored over with fine lines like cracks in a map. Now and again he spun the globe that stood on the table beside him, touching the tips of his fingers to the coloured countries spread over its surface. Africa, the Australias, China, the Indian Empire. Thomas followed them round. Africa, the Australias, and ocean upon ocean. As a young man looking through the windows into this room, this scene, he would have looked upon everything he wanted. And now the wine gleamed golden in his glass. "You are poised," Daubeny said, and spun the globe again. "But of course you realize that, unless you were looking to a bishopric, in which case I would say—" "Good heavens, no. No, I imagine not." Thomas stared into the fire. Whatever Daubeny had wished to discuss with him, he had not expected this, though he supposed that, had he been asked directly, he would have agreed that the master of the college must wish to retire some day. He had simply never given it any thought. It had not concerned him. "You would be the clear choice of the majority, that is not in doubt." "But you yourself—" "Will be 7-1 this year, Thomas. Besides, I have no such ambition." "And have I?" The fire cracked like a pistol shooting a blazing cinder onto the hearth. Africa, the Australias, China, the Indian Empire, Africa, the Australias, and ocean upon ocean. Georgiana sat holding a new book on the history of the Trojan Wars. It was a pet subject of hers, but did not read, only walked the cold-tiled corridors again in her mind, tried to recall Mary Dundas's face. But she had left her address, insisted that she wished to be informed about the funeral. At least she had done that. As he walked back through the empty town streets, the wind came roaring at him down alleyways and around corners, tearing at his clothes, and along the quiet residential avenues the trees thrashed madly together. It was very late. There was scarcely a light in any window. In the end, when the fire had almost died out and the globe had ceased to spin, he had gone back to his own rooms, intending merely to collect some papers and his coat, but instead had sat on in the darkness, going over what had been said, trying to come to terms with it. Only the cold and the last clocks chiming through the courts had driven him out. Above all, he could not understand why the offer, or at least the suggestion of an offer, had not raised his spirits. Why did he not feel pride, vainglory even, the thrill of ambition satisfied? Only, looking ahead, he had seen himself in those rooms, beside those fires, for all the years to come, until death. But what other dreams had he? Where else would he want to go? The wind yowled, racing down the road, hurled itself at him and wrenched the gate from his hand, and then for a second the clouds parted to let out the moon, and turning, he saw some wild fleeing figure on the far side and ahead. But trying to focus on it, looking again, there was nothing, no one. He let himself very quietly into the house. Kitty woke from a nightmare of suffocation into darkness as thick as felt. The room smelt faintly of must and moth and airlessness. She had sunk down into the depths of the feather bed, and the wad of quilt lay like lead over her body. She had forgotten, if she had ever known, how this felt, to breathe in air that was cold and damp, and yet to be stifled at the same time under the weight of bedclothes. In India it was always hot, and the single sheet was always light, but in the hills at dawn the air was cold and fresh as spring water, and then you woke and leaned forward to roll up a blanket that waited ready at the foot of the bed. And, straggling awake from the dreams of drowning, choking, she sat up and could not make out anything around her, could not see her own hand when she held it before her face. And together with relief at being awake after all, being alive, came the thought that she must die. She, Kitty, would die, nothing more certain, the only certainty. She touched her hand to her own face. Die. Be dead. And what was dead? And where? How could that be? Miss Lovelady had said, "We are in the hands of the Lord. We must be on his side, on the side of the right. We should put on the whole armour of God." And she had responded to that with all her heart, to take up a sword and fight on the side of light and against the forces of darkness, to stand up for the poor, the hungry, the oppressed, the imprisoned, the sick, to do battle, to right wrong. All that had sounded an echo in her heart. Now, alone in this dark room of a strange hotel, so many thousands of miles and light years from home, she felt only fear and dread and bewilderment and weakness. And where was Miss Lovelady now? She who had spent 32 years of her life spreading the gospel, who had so stirred Kitty's brave imaginings, who had said, "We cannot choose." With God, so she would have said, but if not, then where? Nowhere. Nothing. The image of the grey bag, drifting down through fathoms of dark water, bobbed about in her mind. It was anchored there, and would never float away. She wanted to call out to her cousin in the adjacent room, but did not, for the cousin was a stranger still, and what would she be able to say or do? And the journey across the window, between the humps and knobs of the unfamiliar furniture, seemed too perilous to make. Then, and strangely, it was for the first time, she thought of her mother, saw Eleanor standing against the light and the softly sifting curtains, smelled her as she lay on the bed beside her. She did not cry, but turned over into her waiting arms and, sighing, fell asleep at once. "But she is old," he thought, stopping suddenly in the doorway. "She is an old woman." Georgiana, sitting beside the fire, reading, her spectacles slightly askew on her nose. The lamp cast shadows under her eye sockets and in furrows down the sides of her mouth, and, seeing her so, he remembered what their mother had looked like. For there she was, before him. He was shaken, for this was his sister, who had always been a child, a young girl to him. And he felt a spurt of anguish and of guilt, too, thought, what life has she had? Does she have? She is alone. She will grow old, is doing so, and I have not noticed, barely thought about her. Does she worry? What does she care about? What dreams, hopes does she still have? He realized that he did not know, had not known for years, nor ever thought to inquire. She saw him, or sensed that he was there, laid her book down. He stepped into the room, but did not that night speak of his conversation with Daubeny. He was not ready, did not know what he thought of it himself, what he wanted. He could not yet discuss it with her. And so they simply sat, side by side, close to the fire, and Alice brought in the tray, and outside the wind roared and beat upon the windows, and the sudden draught made the fire blaze. He wondered if she would care to move into the master's house in the college, to leave here after so many years, to continue to subdue her own life to his. Did she resent him? Perhaps so. Perhaps with reason. But he said only, "So the plans for your holiday were quite abandoned?" Georgiana, set down her book, leaned back in her chair, eyes closed.
"Oh, yes. Florence has gone today to fetch her niece. The ship will have docked now. I think they travel back to Cambridge tomorrow."
"I see. I had no idea how much it was all a great disappointment."
"Florence's niece?"
"The holiday in Switzerland."
"Oh, no."
She made a slight dismissive gesture. "No." For perhaps it would not have been very satisfactory. They would have quarrelled, or the weather would have been too cold, or else she would not have felt completely well. Something, anything. Perhaps it had never been a good plan. "You seem tired."
"Yes."
"Perhaps you ought to see Hannon again. Your cough—"
"Oh, that will linger until the warmer weather. You know that it so often does. I am perfectly resigned to it."
"Yes, the air is at a low ebb. But there were aconites and snowdrops out in the fellow's garden today."
"And a terrible wind. I walked a long way against it. I dare say that is why I am tireder than usual."
"Walked?"
"To the old hospital. I was sent for by Mary Dundas."
"Mary Dundas?"
"The maid. Years ago. You will not remember."
He did not.
"But she was dead. Since yesterday I must have meant something to her all these years for her to send so urgently. I failed her. She was already dead."
"But you were not to know. Of course you—"
"I should have gone at once. I did not, and the fault is mine."
Her voice was flat and dull. He recognized the depth of her self-blame and did not again try to dismiss it, said nothing. But after a while longer, got up and went into the conservatory, where the small birds had gone to roost, and only stirred, fluttered a little as he entered, before quietening and settling back again. He closed the door and sat down among them in the darkness. In the small parlour, Georgiana stayed on, thinking of nothing in particular, before the dying fire, too weary for the moment to face the effort of going up to bed. Adele Hemmings walks alone through the dark avenues, past all the shuttered, respectable houses, and the wildness of the wind delights her, excites her, the wind lifting her clothes, and the rain running down her face, and finding a way beneath her clothes to her body, and sliding cold over her skin. For she goes out every night now, or almost, very late, after her aunt has gone to bed. And if her aunt does not want to go to bed, but sits up, demands cards and tea and the serial story read aloud to her once again, and conversation and company, then she is scarcely able to bear the frustration. She feels a restlessness like an itch, the desire, the need to be out alone in the darkness, walking, blots out all other thought. But in the end, the old woman does go, heavily, painfully up the stairs. In the end, the lights are out, and the cats, too, slipping away from the house, down through the garden, and Adele Hemmings is one of them, but they are intent upon their own secret, malevolent business. And no one sees her, no one is aware, except perhaps one man returning late glimpses a figure, running before the wind, or a nursemaid up to a restless child and glancing between the curtains down into the night streets. Or perhaps, after all, it is only shadows moving in the wind. And so she ventures further, away from the shelter of the familiar avenue, out from under the protection of the walls and overhanging trees, into the lanes that thread the town, under the old buildings, and away towards the open spaces, her feet soft on the grass nearer to the river. Here she is not alone. Here are others hidden among the tree trunks, in the shadows, alone or together. And perhaps she sees or senses them, perhaps not. But either way does not care. She is exhilarated simply by being here in the wind and rain and darkness, far from the stifling house and the smell of more than a dozen cats and the snores of her porcine aunt, who, if she wakes, breathless, sweating, unwell, afraid, and fumbles for the bell that is always close to hand, and rings loudly, demandingly, and calls, will not be answered, not be heard. But perhaps for now she sleeps, and Adele Hemmings walks along the path beside the water towards the mill, and her heart pounds with pleasure, and the sky races ahead of the wind, and the sound of her footsteps, like the calling voice and the desperate bell, will never be heard. Chapter 7. The two friends, Amelia Hartshorn and Marjorie Pepys, faced one another again, sitting on either side of the hearth in the cottage in Warwickshire. It was as though there had never been any interlude, any parting, except that things were, in one respect, so terribly changed. The room, though, was precisely the same. Nothing had been disturbed or moved, been taken away or added since Miss Hartshorn had left, and the wood still came down almost to the back door, and the river ran through the water meadows beyond the sloping front garden as they had always done. Now the wind crashed through the trees, and somewhere in the midst of them ripped one old and weak and rotten out of its socket and hurled it to the ground. It had rained for days. The river was running fast and rising up the banks.
There was no wind there. I missed the wind. Wind in the trees and rain on the roof. The sounds were all quite different in India,
she would have said, but did not. She found she could not bring herself to speak of India at all. The 2 years were blown away like scraps, flimsy and inconsequential, and so forgotten. To speak of them, to try and recall, reminisce, evoke, seemed scarcely worth the effort it would cost. The things she had seen, the beauty and the strangeness and the horror of it all to her, became like dreams or fantasies, far away and fading further.
So I was wrong to go, quite wrong. There was too much boredom and too many terrible sights. The heat was too stifling, the dust too thick. The brightness glared in my eyes. I was made to feel subservient. I had no friends. I should have listened to you. I should not have gone,
she would have said, but did not, nor ask.
And you? What have you, alone here for almost 2 years? Tell me that.
But did not. The cottage had not changed. Not this room in it, nor the wood behind it, nor the water meadows that led to the river. But Marjorie Pepys had changed. Seeing her first at the door, Miss Hartshorn had almost recoiled with shock and distress. Now she sat opposite to her across the hearth, and saw that she had missed the last years of her friend's life, and must soon lose her, and then be alone here, to come to terms with her death and her own burden of guilt. Marjorie Pepys's sight was failing, the eyes rheumy and vague. She had been a plump woman, and now she was thin as a bird, with fragile, brittle bones sticking out through the stretched, dry, parchment skin. She had been dark, and now was grey, the hair like fluff, had been confident, definite, certain, her movements sure, and now trembled and fumbled and shrank back into herself. Yet she had said nothing, given no hint of illness in any letter, and so in what way could it be referred to, this terrible final change? What words would encompass it? There were none. Only within her, Miss Hartshorn's voice called out for an answer, an explanation, and tried to comfort and reassure. But aloud they merely spoke of the wind in the trees and the rising river and the dog which lay on the hearthrug between them, and still smelled chokingly. And Miss Hartshorn unpacked a little and brought out a gift or two, trivial things, wondered fleetingly about Kitty, but did not care. Only once, as she passed closer to her chair on the way out of the stifling little room, Marjorie Pepys reached out and perhaps tried to touch her hand and hold it. But the gesture was vague and made in the wrong direction, and came to nothing after all. Chapter 8. And the sun shone, and the air was mild, and suddenly, miraculously, for this one day it was already spring. The light bathed the stones of the buildings and sparkled on the river and played on the arches of the bridges that spanned it. Waking at dawn in the pretty new room, and drawing her curtains back, Kitty saw a new world, in a soft pale light of a kind she had never seen or imagined, rare, beautiful, and at once all the greyness, the cold and rain of her first days here were swept away, and with them her own apprehensions and low spirits.
"Oh, but this is beautiful,"
she said, walking up the avenue with her cousin under the boughs of the bare trees.
"Oh!"
They stopped. Ahead of them, across the green lawns, King's Chapel soared to heaven, riding like a great ship moored. Birds wheeled in the sky above the towers and turrets and pinnacles and tree-tops all around.
"It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen."
And Florence, looking at her rapt face, caught Kitty's delight, and saw it all anew herself, and gloried in it, and her own spirits rose, too. They walked slowly on. At their feet the open cups of crocuses sprouted from the new grass, maundy purple, white and egg yolk gold. A thrush delved between. On the river, and in the mud beside the river, ducks dived and bobbed about in pairs. Moorhens swam, and the willows were hazed yellow-green.
"Oh,"
Kitty said again and again,
"oh,"
and turned this way and that as they walked, looking in amazement around her. And so they went about the whole morning, walked and walked in the limpid sunshine, under archways and through gateways, in and out of courts, went into a tea-shop to drink hot chocolate, for out of the sun the east wind still blew cold down passageways and across the grass from off the far fens, came out again among the horses and cabs, young men and the bicycles, to walk further still, Kitty's head a kaleidoscope of everything she saw. Her eyes feasted on it in jubilation. It seemed that she could walk and look for hours and never tire, and so Florence, walking with her, did not tire either. And the spring sun shone on old Mrs. Grey, sitting in the bay window, who felt it warm on her face, and closed her eyes and dozed a little in pleasure, and Georgiana opened the doors of the window that let onto the garden and went out lighter of heart than for weeks past, to look for signs of the upturn of the year among the shrubs and plants. It was, for this one day, as if the world stood quite still, suspended between the gales and cold and lowering skies of the long winter and others perhaps to come, and within this frail capsule of warmth and new light, people blossomed briefly, and were soothed, smiled at one another, and spoke and strolled more quietly through the streets, and stood companionably in groups on the paths beside the grass and running down to the river. At the house in the country, which had been taken over at last by workmen, by joiners and tilers and painters and boys carrying hods, the sun shone through empty window sockets and lay in lemon-coloured fans across the bare, dusty boards, and at noon the men took their bread outside to sit on piles of stones and planks about the derelict yards and cobbles, snatching what they could of this unlooked-for spring, before going back to prepare the place for so many as yet unfallen women. And other women stood in the open doorways of cottages, and for a few minutes took the sun, and the babies played in the dirt at their feet, and out on the fens the warmth briefly stirred men and birds and plants, and all the rest into new life. But in the end, after all, they must return for lunch, though Kitty protested, feeling that she might walk or even dance in the sun here forever. Only on King's Parade, Florence met a friend, newly returned from away, and must talk, and so Kitty went on ahead, through the gateway and around the paths, slowly, in the direction of the river, and felt at once very, very young, new-born on such a morning, and altogether adult to be here for these moments, quite alone. Which was how Thomas Cavendish saw her, standing quite still on the curved stone bridge. And he, head down, was preoccupied, going over and over his talk with Daubeny, and all that might follow from it, though he was also aware of the day, that it seemed to be spring. He did not know her. There was no reason why he should know her. It was simply that, stepping aside to make way for someone or other, and looking up, he saw her there. She wore a pale dress and coat, and her hair was off her face. Her hand rested on the parapet, and he was reminded of some still, entirely graceful bird glimpsed on the margin of the shore. She did not look in his direction, and so, after a moment, he walked on towards the streets of the town and the college at which he was to lunch. And it was not for 10 minutes or so more that Florence came, hurrying to rejoin Kitty. He and she did not meet then at all. Why does the weather affect us so? Georgiana thought. She had carried one of the basket chairs onto the terrace, and sat there, her hands idle in her lap. Why should this sun, this unexpected warmth, and how the earth smells, the cloudlessness of the sky, make such a difference to everything, to the way we feel and hope and behave towards one another? The previous day, and for some weeks past, she had been tired and bleak-spirited. There had seemed to be so little point to anything in her life, in all their lives. Yet now, in this first spring sunshine, there seemed nothing wrong that could not easily be put right, and she looked to a new future, new prospects, though how or of what she could not have told. And of course the previous day had not only been cold still, cold and wet with a harsh wind blowing about the curded grey sky, it had been the day of Mary Dundas's funeral. Georgiana had followed the coffin, had stood in the dark little chapel and at the burial ground beside the open grave, and been entirely alone, save for the clergyman and some hospital official, a bald man in a dun-coloured coat, to whom she did not speak. And feeling the harsh, spiteful pins of rain on her face, she had wept tears of anger and bitterness and guilt, as well as of sadness, that anyone should have lived through their last weeks, and how many others before, and died and now should be buried so, without family or friends. Even I, she had thought in shame, I am only here when it is too late. For Mary Dundas sent for me, though I scarcely remembered her, and I delayed and did not come until after she was dead. And was there any good reason for that? There are too many alone, she said, and as she stood there, looking down at the crumblings of earth on the bare coffin, had thought of so many. And then of Florence, alone, for all there was her old mother, and Adele Hemmings with no one save for the unloved, unloving aunt. And she herself, too, she realized, she and Thomas, for whichever of them died first would leave the other quite alone. Unless, she supposed vaguely, her brother were to marry, but dismissed the idea at once, knowing that he would not. She thought of Alice. So that as soon as she reached home, she had gone to talk to her for a long time, sat on the chair beside the range in the kitchen, and told her about Mary Dundas's funeral, and then, for something else to say, about Florence's cousin, Kitty Moorhead, from India, though Alice, used to being left to herself, was disturbed, and looked at Georgiana oddly from time to time, uneasy until, in the end, she left. For Alice had her friends, the others who went with her to the spiritualist church, as well as those awaiting them there, and who were always with her now, presences, voices, so that Alice never felt truly alone. There was warmth and balminess in the air until late in the afternoon, though the shadows were long, and the sun had gone off the garden. Georgiana walked up to where the clumps of daffodils were bright, brighter even since that morning, against the dark leaves of the laurels and rhododendrons, and the last of the snowdrops hid beside the first of the crocuses at the foot of the trunk of the great old beech. And her heart was lighter. She had prayed for the soul of Mary Dundas, but then put the memory of her and of the previous day behind her, for she could do nothing else now. She looked forward to a meeting of the Friends of the Missions to China later that week, and a visit she was to make to a home for moral welfare in London, and to Florence's coming to dinner with her cousin Kitty Moorhead. She looked forward to the summer and the shouts of the young men as they rowed down the river, and the garden parties, and the music that would float across from summer balls. Life seemed suddenly to be springing up again all around her. There was brightness and laughter and hope in the world. So that arriving home a little early, while she was still outside in the last of the late afternoon light, Thomas saw the change in her at once, something lighter, younger in her face and her eyes, and his own spirits were lifted by it, and he laughed with her over some story as they took a last slow turn around the garden, and the sky above the bare trees was streaked rose and violet and gold. "I have not spoken to you until now. There was so much to think of." "Of course." "And I am still thinking of it. I have not yet come to terms with the idea." "So you have made no decision?" No, and naturally I had to consult you in every way. It is only that you have seemed rather tired. I thought it best not to trouble you." "Yes, I have been very low-spirited, not completely well. So many things have oppressed me." "But it is not like you to give in to that. You have so much energy. You always face things with such vigour. You know I have always admired that in you, admired your courageousness."
She looked up at him in astonishment and flushed a little for pleasure. Praise from him now was as much her lifeblood as it had ever been. She felt at once prouder, stronger in the light of his approval.
And looking at him across the room, she began to consider him already as master of the college, and it seemed to her an inevitable thing, though the idea had never in truth occurred to her before now. He had the stature for it, and the gravity. "Oh, it is what you deserve," she said in earnest. "Deserve? Why so?"
"Because you are a fine scholar. You have good judgment. You are wise. You have served the college faithfully, and because it seems natural and right."
For a moment he smiled, as he had often smiled at her when she was a girl, and had been extravagant in praise of him, believing him, as she had, to be a giant, a hero, a god.
"And you are exactly the right age. You have many more vigorous years ahead."
"But you are speaking as if the matter is settled, decided, and of course you know that it is not. Daubeny has raised the subject."
"And told you that you would have the clear majority of the college in your favour."
"Yes." But then, for a long time he was silent, staring into the fire, for the evening had grown suddenly cold. It was not yet spring, after all.
Was it this, Georgiana wondered, this, knowing it somehow, even before I knew it, this which gave me new hope, and stirred some interest in the future again? Strangely, she realized that the idea of leaving this house, in which she had lived so comfortably for so many years, did not trouble her at all. They would, she supposed, simply let it, and it would be here for them to return to in old age, at the end of it all. She thought of the master's lodging, tall, finely proportioned, gracing the corner of the inner court, went through what rooms she knew in her mind, and around the beautiful garden, whose lawns ran down to the river. She had never been ambitious for herself, never even to marry and have her own family. She was content so long as she had a few of her own useful activities to live through him. But she would enjoy being the mistress of that house, she thought, now, and felt a stirring of excitement, pride even, at the prospect of their new station, and was surprised at herself, and sufficiently human, sufficiently detached, to be a little amused, too. Thought suddenly, but Florence would want it. Yes. Then, looking at her brother's face again, said, "But you are not sure at all?" "No." "You don't doubt your own abilities, or that you would be a fitting man for the position?" "No, I think not." "Then what?" He stood up and went to the window, drew the curtains back a little. The moon had risen.
Perhaps I am very happy as I am. I have all I have ever wanted. I am simply not ambitious in that way.
No.
Should I be?
Oh, you are as you are, Thomas. You should be true to that, only—
It is what you want for me.
Only do not dismiss it because you are comfortable. Would rather not be disturbed.
Afraid to change?
Yes.
Slothful?
No, but I am only asking you to consider it carefully. Look ahead.
I do.
And it is an honour, surely.
He glanced round, hearing the note of pride in her voice, warmed, as he had always been, by her love and support for him, remembered that she had devoted herself and her life to him. Perhaps she deserved this. He should think of that, and he could not pretend that he had not been flattered, and perhaps would revel in it all, in the authority, the power even. But after a few minutes more he put it out of his mind, unable to reach any conclusion, and unwilling to fret over it longer, and went into the conservatory to see to the little birds, and afterwards worked until very late on his bird book, and drew more than his usual joy and satisfaction from it, drinking it in like cool water. For this was what he wanted, what he did best, loved best, to be here in this quiet room among these books and maps and drawings and birds, here or else out on the marshes in his boat. These were the only places. Everything else, he thought, must resolve itself as it would, but he would not trouble himself greatly with it. But at the back of his mind there was something else, some other half-remembered thing, some sight or awareness or emotion, but he could not recall it or name it. It was simply as though there were some area of warmth and brightness which, from time to time, as he worked, he felt himself close to, as he might row out of the shadows into a patch of sunlit water, and it was, in some strange way he did not understand, an inexpressible source of joy and absolute content. But what? What? Chapter 9. Later, the weather would change again. Later, clouds would bank up and gales rush in, driving rain before them from the west. Later, only a little later, winter would return, and the one bright day of spring be scarcely remembered. But now it was a still, mild night. Now the moon rode and shone on the grey houses, the calm fields, on Florence sleeping a satisfied sleep, for now she felt that it was her mission to guide her cousin Kitty and help her to take full advantage of England. For the time being she was happy and full of good purpose, though every night she remembered the words of the professor of fine art. "A woman can make any man marry her, if only she will go about it in the right way." For she was not deflected from her purpose. On old Mrs. Grey, awake as always, and eating biscuits from a rose-patterned tin, and drinking Malvern water, and contemplating Kitty Moorhead, Eleanor's child. Plain, she thought, a plain girl, and yet hovering on the brink of beauty. A child, and yet a child no longer. Well, she would do to occupy Florence, who had had too little to do with the young, never having had children of her own, and might soften her. Though the diversion would not last, for she was thoroughly aware of her daughter's desires and frustrations. She selected another biscuit, and listened with pleasure to the owls in the trees on the far side of the river. The old, she thought, can do anything, say anything and be indulged, forgiven. Like children. It is our reward, we should make the most of it. But how many did? How many did? Now the moon rode higher in the sky, rode over the parsonage where Cecil Moxton lay asleep, and his wife lay awake, heavy with child for these few last days. and over the house where Eustace Partridge slept fitfully, though not in the same bed, or even in the same room now as his young, bewildered wife, who was no longer with child, and would never be so again, and who was not to blame, but could not believe it. And the gulf between them was wider than any dividing wall, wider than continents, though he treated her kindly and with infinite concern, and so, in a way, she was happy. Rode over Miss Hartshorn and Miss Pepys in the cottage in Warwickshire, where a rabbit screamed in terror of a stoat in the woods that came up to the house, and on the empty house in Norfolk, and the grave of Mary Dundas that would never be tended, never be dear to any heart, and over the sea, which was Miss Lovelady's grave, where no gravestone would ever be, over the colleges and the chapels, the river and the meadows, and all the fields around, out to the house in the country, waiting. And on Adele Hemmings, who tonight slipped out of the house and out of her coat to walk naked through the dark streets and over the sweet cold grass. The moon rode until the first of the clouds came over it, and the rain spattered on the wind as, far away, the storm gathered.
This is the end of CD 4. The book continues on CD 5. CD 5.
Chapter 10. At first, as he came suddenly awake, it was his mother who filled his mind, and he was taken aback by it, for he thought of her so rarely, or either of his parents. He was not a man who had ever dwelled greatly on the past, though sometimes he allowed himself to think fondly of Nana Quinn and of the holidays at the house in Ireland, remembered with a spurt of joy his days out in the boat with Colm O'Cool. But he never thought, as he suspected that Georgiana did think, of the past as being a perfect place, forever to be mourned and yearned for, always to be preferred to the present. That seemed to him something like a weakness, a kind of ingratitude. He would have said always, "I am perfectly content to live here, in the present." But now, coming awake, he remembered his mother, and perhaps he had been half dreaming of her too, and the vision of her was clear to him. But it was not the sight of her that was so strong, so much as the whole aura of her presence, her smell, her sound, the texture of her clothing, the movement of the very air that surrounded her. He was a small boy, 5 or 6 years old, and he had fallen down the stairs. He lay at the foot, not badly injured, after all, but bruised and frightened, and she had been coming along the upper landing and seen him fall, but been quite unable to save him, had only come flying down after him, and sat on the bottom step beside him and gathered him up to her. And it so rarely happened, because she was so rarely there. He saw very little of her. It was Nana Quinn, or one of the maids, who usually saw to him, and whom he would have expected. But now, in the midst of his hurt and confusion of it all, when the world had suddenly slipped from beneath him and thrown him upside down, now it was she, his mother, who was miraculously here, and he clung to her in relief and in rapture, buried his head in the woolen material of her dress, and inhaled her sweet, particular smell. The pain and shock of falling were not so much obliterated as welcomed, because they had been the cause of this, and he had held to her in desperation, knowing that once she moved away, set him at arm's length from her, she would not take him to her again, nor allow herself to be persuaded or cajoled. But for a few moments longer they had sat together, and the memory had burned into him, so that from time to time, for the rest of his life, it would surface, and he could savour it. Now he lay, and it was with him again, the strong sense of his mother's presence, her closeness, and the strength of the joy it had given him was remembered too. The memory did not disturb him. He did not puzzle over or try to repress it, felt no guilt. Though why it should have been with him now, he could not tell. But as he came more fully awake, he was aware of something else, some other recollection. He shifted about restlessly in his bed. The night was very silent, very still. The moon shone. He got up and crossed the room, and pulling back the curtain thought he saw, what? Shadows? A figure? Some movement between the trees at the bottom of the garden? A pale shape? Then nothing, and a cloud slid in front of the moon. But just as he turned away, he could tell that it was a cat, caught the gleam of its eyes as it slunk across the grass towards the shrubbery. He shuddered, hating cats as he did, irrationally, violently, not merely for fear of what they might do to his birds, what indeed they did daily, nightly to all manner of small creatures. His fear was darker, more primitive, so that he was alarmed by, even ashamed of it. He half turned, wanting to go out of the house and drive the animal away, to lash out at it somehow, banish it forever from his garden, but restrained himself, did not move. And after a few seconds, looking back, he saw that the cat had gone out of sight into the shadows. Then, as he let the curtain drop from his hand and settle, it came to him, as unbidden, unexpected, and bewildering as the sudden vision of his mother to which he had awakened. He saw the girl on the bridge, standing, still, poised as a bird in the sunlight, looking down into the water. And with the sight of her came a strange suffusion of emotion that he did not recognize, but which dissolved and dissipated all of his violent rage and revulsion from the prowling cat, calmed and soothed him, yet disturbed him too. He lay down in the darkness. Did he know her after all? Perhaps it was so. Carefully he went over the young women known to him. Cecil Moxton's daughters, those of the dean, and one or two other members of his college. But they were very few, and although he scarcely knew them, he thought he would have recognized their faces. She was not one of them. He knew nothing about her then, had simply come upon her by chance, had never seen her before, and would not, in all probability, ever see her again. Then why did he recall her? Without realizing it, he allowed himself to retain the image of her as he went to sleep, and the contentment that it gave him. And because he was still wholly ignorant, wholly innocent, he felt nothing else, neither anxiety, nor alarm, nor any distress. Chapter 11. Eleanor bends her head and splashes the water from her cupped hands over her face again and again. And it is cold water, wonderfully, icily cold, and she remembers once more this intense, simple pleasure which awaits her year after year. In Calcutta the water is never cold, always tepid, lukewarm, and in the last few weeks, as the weather has grown hotter again, at the end of the season, so the water has seemed suddenly intolerably warm and somehow slimy. One can never be refreshed by it. But now she is installed at last in the bungalow in the hills. It perches on a ledge high up, above and below other ledges, other bungalows, and the streets and avenues run along and slope a little, and everywhere there are the views, the amazing sight of the far mountains. And there has been the usual long trek to get here, and before that the weeks of planning and packing, supervising the household move. Eleanor is quite exhausted. But it is all worth it, as always. Worth it because of this, the wonderful coldness of the water, and the sharp, sweet freshness of the air, which she also drinks in great draughts at dawn and dusk. Oh, and the flowers, the cottage gardens, and the sight of the banks of wild rhododendrons growing up the slopes, and the Scotch pines, and the blue mauve haze of the near hills, the floating snow-caps of the far. And to have escaped the heat and dust and the staleness and the raw brightness and the smells of the hot weather on the plains. It is all worth it. Or would be, if it were not that she wonders now, what is the point of it all? The point of any of her life, there or here? And instead of feeling refreshed and exhilarated in anticipation of the spring and summer, she already feels jaded, weary in advance, bored before it has even begun. The social round, the calling and the rides, the picnics and parties and mornings at church and afternoons at the library and teas at the hotel and drinks at the club, and then all the nonsense of fancy dress and theatricals. Worst of all, it is the thought of so many women together which depresses her. There are men, of course, men on leave and the men who work up here, for a lot of them move up for the whole season, as Lewis will move up in a month or so. But still, many of them do not come. Many are obliged to sweat it out in the heat on the plains. It is too much a society of women and the younger children. Yet it would not matter. She could still plunge herself into the life and the months to come, and not only make the best of them, but enjoy them thoroughly, and feel them to be worthwhile, if it were not for the stone heaviness that lies on her heart, and the pain of anxiety, if it were not, quite simply, for the terrible absence of Kitty. She sits now at the open bay window, overlooking the veranda and the opposite hills, and hears the whistling of some servant or other, and the hoofs of horses echoing across the valley, but sees nothing, hears nothing, for her mind is full of Kitty. Kitty's presence fills the room. Where is she now, and with whom? Is she happy, homesick, well or ill? Does she also sit at a window and dream of and long for another place? It seems to Eleanor an insane, an unimaginable thing to have done, let Kitty go after all the years of keeping her close, defying the custom, earning the disapproval of all those whose children have, naturally, been sent away. But she did not weep, had not. Weeping was too facile a thing, only sat on, looking out and seeing Kitty, seeing England, home, and longing bitterly for them both. But a little before 4 she is obliged to dress and walk out, to return a call on the wife of the district commissioner, and, just for having done her hair and made herself look well, she feels better, more willing to face the day. And she meets this person and that person, all women, all strolling along the Mall, for all the world as if it were the promenade at Eastbourne, and the air is fresh and quite delightful, and she does, she reminds herself, have a certain position here, and being here has a duty, too, to represent Lewis. So that when she catches sight of little subdued one-faced Myrtle Pinkerton, whose child had died, she crosses over the road to greet her, and seeing the relief and gratitude in the young woman's face, feels encouraged by having done the right thing, and makes an arrangement to have luncheon with her the following day. And Kitty, for the moment, steps back a little into the shadows. Chapter 12. "Oh, but the spring," Georgiana said in bitter frustration. "Whatever happened to the spring? I had begun to feel so much better, really quite uplifted. Oh, treachery!" For they sat huddled in the little parlour after lunch, over a fire that smoked and would not draw, and outside the wind blew a gale again, that lashed rain at the windows, and had already brought down the early boughs of blossom, scattering them all anyhow onto path and pavement, had battered the first daffodils, and sent the rest of the world scurrying back to its lair. Now the wind was strengthening again. The 2 women sat, hearing the trees lash together like waves of the sea. They had eaten mutton and capers and coconut sponge, but then Georgiana had planned a walk around the garden, and perhaps further, up the avenue towards the backs in the sunshine. Instead, they could only stare at the awful fire and talk of raising a subscription to pay for the furnishing of the house in the country, going over and over the old names. And Florence had had a letter from the matron of St. Faith's Shelter in East London.
"We are welcome to visit any weekend to suit our convenience. The late morning would be the most suitable."
Georgiana glanced out of the window at the grey sky.
"Perhaps in a week or two. Perhaps we should wait until there is some prospect of our enjoying the outing." "And we shall make it an outing. Travel up by train and stay overnight, perhaps 2 nights, at a good hotel. There are no end of things we might do. Theatres, galleries, the shops in Piccadilly."
Florence stood up and walked to the window, waved her hand dismissively at the outside world.
"Never mind about the weather. We shall simply ignore it. We have far better things to consider."
Georgiana looked up at her, tall and stately against the light, her hair coiled, thought, yes, she should be the wife of the college master, the mistress of his house. She would become the position so well, give it such style. But since Christmas, or before, since feeling so unwell and having so many things that weighed so heavily upon her, she felt that she had gradually lost what desires she had had for her own independence and freedom. More and more she wanted merely to settle back and live the quiet, dull life she had, after all, always lived here. Her energy had drained away, and she was in retreat from the thought of any challenge, any change. And so the idea of giving up this last prospect of a comfortable life as her brother's support when he became master, for there was no doubt at all in her mind that he was surely destined for that, the idea of Florence's marrying him and so supplanting her depressed her intolerably. For where would she herself be in that event? Where would she go? She saw herself in a dim little back sitting-room of the master's house, growing dowdy, disregarded and patronized as his spinster sister, or else remaining here, rattling around in this house alone.
"Yes, London," Florence said energetically. "Let us fix a day, and I shall write to the matron. In any case, London has been on my mind, for I must take Kitty there, too. She has such a desire to see everything, quite a hunger for it. It is rather touching." "She is not homesick?"
Florence returned to her chair.
"She scarcely speaks of home, of her parents, or India at all. It is really impossible to know what she feels. She is such an earnest little thing, so serious, so solemn. She says that she wants to do good in the world. I dare say that was something she learned from the missionary woman on the ship." "But that was a terrible experience for a young girl, to be so close to sudden death." "She is not pretty," Florence said, "and she is in many ways very gauche, a child still, after all. But she is very composed, quite self-contained. My mother has greatly taken to her. They play piquet." "And you are enjoying her company too, and it is very good for you." "Well, I intend to organize her education. That is my role. That is why she came to me. I plan all manner of things, trips, art classes, and some socializing. I am trying to round up some companions of her own age. Oh, it will all be great fun." "And you will bring her here to dine? I had thought of next Saturday." "Thank you. Yes, I am so anxious for her to make new friends."
But she dared not mention Thomas, ask whether he might be present, only stared at the rain on the window and listened to the wind and willed that he would join them, that she might be given another chance. And then, after a while, they bestirred themselves, and the bell was rung for Alice to bring in coffee, and they began to discuss the subscription list in greater earnest.
"No, you have the ace of clubs, so you must set it down." "Oh, so I have, but how did you know?" "If you were a small girl, I suppose I would say that I had magic eyes and could see through the backs of the cards." But as I am an older girl, you will say it is because you have been playing the game since long before I was born. Correct. So set down the ace, so my jack there. Oh, how vexing.
They were playing in the drawing-room after tea. The lamps were already lit. It was so dark outside, dark and wet, had been like it the whole day. England was grey again. There had been one glimpse of spring, one sunlit day. Nothing more.
Is that how you would describe yourself?
Old Mrs. Grey peered at her over the top of her half-spectacles, over a hand of cards.
An older girl, I suppose, or a young woman? You are both. You are of an age when you may be anything like me. I would tell you to make the most of it, but I need not, because, you see, if you are lucky, it all comes around again.
But she saw that, of course, Kitty did not understand.
Whereas Florence...
And she selected a tin of clubs and laid it carefully, deliberately down.
Florence is what she is and can be no other. You mean she is a grown woman? Florence has always been a grown woman. She was one when she was 6. I used to think that if she had had children of her own, she would have had the chance to become a child herself after all. But now I am very doubtful. It is very hard to imagine people as children once they are not.
Even me?
No, Kitty smiled. No, not you.
For it was perfectly true.
You are remarkably like your mother when you smile, so you will be as beautiful as she is. I suppose she is still a beauty. Oh, yes. People say it all the time. In Calcutta, it is what she is known for. But Cousin Florence is beautiful too, do you not think? No. She's handsome, perhaps, but her jaw is too square and forceful for beauty. You see, I do not think my goose a swan, though she is my only goose. But you do love her. Ah, love. You must. Not all mothers love their children. Did no one ever tell you that? Have you not observed it for yourself? No.
Kitty felt suddenly disturbed, upset in some vague way that made her feel physically uncomfortable.
Well, it is true. An unpleasant fact, but you're quite old enough to have to face some unpleasant facts.
The cards rested between them on the low table, and limp in their hands. The game was apparently suspended.
Do you wonder when life will begin? I dare say you do. You didn't cross half the world to play cards on a wet afternoon with an old woman. I like to do it. Life will begin when Florence decides. She is busy trying to fix up classes for you, lessons in this and outings to that, and then she will go about finding you some friends. She will succeed, too. She's a very good organiser when she sets her mind to it. She's organised that home for fallen women into existence. Has she told you about that? Fallen women? Good heavens, don't tell me you haven't any idea what I mean. Has Eleanor kept you in complete ignorance? How very foolish. I always think that is. Girls should know. I think fallen women are women who are not married but who are going to have babies. Well, it is all very natural and what happens in life, for all the world likes to pretend otherwise. And of course they have to go somewhere, poor things. Though why should they necessarily be poor, I wonder? Because they so often are poor. Often, but by no means always. Well, so Florence has been putting all her energies into that. She has bought a house in the country to be converted. Did you know that she was extremely rich? Her husband left her a fortune. I have no money. She talks to me as if I was simply another woman, another adult, Kitty realized. And if I was 6, she would have done the same. I dare say she always talked to Cousin Florence like it, too. And that explains why she was a grown woman at that age. If only her mother knew it.
And was rather pleased with herself for the deduction.
"You will be very good for her," Mrs. Gray was saying now. "Perhaps you will make her young."
She stared hard at Kitty again and then looked away, into the fire.
"Except that you seem to be travelling in opposite directions." "I'm not sure I understand."
But there was no reply. The old woman sat brooding, silent and perhaps half asleep, so that in the end Kitty went, very quietly, out of the room and upstairs. And the light in her bedroom was pale, soft grey, less dark because it was so high up, the windows let in so much sky, and she stood, watching the rain slide down the grey roofs, not happy, not unhappy, nothing, waiting, perhaps, for life to begin. Of India and her mother and father she neither thought nor avoided thinking. They were simply there. She carried them with her, and could turn towards them, stretching her arms out to them at any time, and so, in a curious way, she did not need to miss them. Nor did she ever speculate about what they might be doing at this moment or that, or try to picture them here or there, or even to work out what time of day or night it might be with them. It was all somehow frozen, suspended in time, as when she had left, and they were doing nothing. The move to the hills, for example, had not taken place. No changes had been made whatsoever. It was simply like a silent, motionless, bright tableau, framed, expectant. After a while, for she had a headache and her throat was slightly sore, she lay down on her bed and eventually slept, as old Mrs. Gray slept, as usual before the fire, so that neither of them heard Florence when she came sweeping, flushed, buoyant into the house. Chapter 13. Because, quite suddenly, at the end of the afternoon, as Florence was putting on her hat, Georgiana had blurted it out.
"They have asked him if he will allow himself to be put forward as the next master. He is the choice of nearly all the fellows."
But the moment it was out, the moment she saw Florence's face, the eyes bright, she thought, "I should never have spoken of it. It was entirely wrong." Then why had she? For now surely she had changed everything, spoiled her own future. She had stopped the cab, dismissed it, and then walked alone, slowly, up the avenue between the trees in the pouring rain, and had not minded it at all, had welcomed it, stepped across the curved stone bridge, but did not pause, did not linger there, as her cousin Kitty had lingered, and so on towards his college. It had been dismal, dark now as well as wet, the lamps blurred in the early evening mist, but she had walked slowly, savouring every step through the gateway and under the arch into the outer court, and then stood in the shadow of the walls, imagining, planning. For he would be the master, there was no doubt in her mind. It was surely all quite settled. As soon as Georgiana had spoken, it had seemed to her inevitable. And then, of course, he must marry her. That was inevitable, too. He would need to be married in that position, though others were not, but she chose not to think of them. And whom else might he marry? But it should not merely be for convenience. She thought, he will love me, want as I do. A woman can make any man marry her if only she will go about it in the right way. She believed it, absolutely. And after a time of standing and then of walking around the courtyards, of looking up at lighted windows and across the squares of grass towards other archways, other doors, she turned and so went home through the rain, her heart thudding, knowing what must happen, tense and bright with determination. But perhaps, after all, he will say no, for he likes his life as it is now. Or someone else will be preferred, Georgiana thought, sitting in front of the mound of writing paper and envelopes at her desk. "Dear Lady, dear Canon, dear Miss L." for she should not have spoken. He would be bitterly angry if he knew. She had seen Florence's face change, with anticipation, excitement, and a sort of greed.
"Oh, Alice, I will only have some soup and perhaps toast. My brother is dining in college."
But Alice, setting down her spiritualist newspaper, clacked and fast and would bake a little dish of baked eggs or an omelette, and then there were some poached pears. Georgiana was not to let herself go again, and so she sat in state at one end of the dining table, obliged to eat a meal, and hearing only the tick of the clock and the scrape of her knife against the china, thought suddenly, in dread, "And how often will it be like this in the future? How many evenings will I spend eating alone in a silent room, there or here, in this house still, if it happens, if he becomes the master of his college, if he marries Florence, as I have always planned that he would?" Chapter 14. The week went by. It was milder, but still wet and grey. Daffodils came into bud, but did not break. Kitty had a feverish cold and lay in bed, or hunched in a chair beneath a rug, and, for the first time, missed India, and could not turn her mind away from missing it, and from the recollections that filled her, of the gardens of their house in Calcutta, with the scarlet and orange flowers blazing from the beds, and the fountains splashing up and over and down. She lay and let the pictures come before her eyes and gazed at them. And now Eleanor would be in the hills, and so she let herself imagine them too, the snow line and the mauve blue of the nearer slopes, and the echo of voices calling, singing, ringing across from the other side of the green valley. But her dreams and her visions were curiously unpeopled, nor did they upset her. She felt no sense of homesickness or loss or longing. Somehow those feelings were quite absent, as though they had been extracted, like the painful nerves of an open tooth, so that it was now dead. She merely looked on the scenes of India through the grey, dank Cambridge afternoons, and they gave her pleasure. For the rest of the time she sank down into the miserable depths of her cold, and allowed Florence and Louisa and Ina, the maids, to bring her hot drinks and inhalations, and saw the doctor twice, for Florence took her responsibility seriously, and looked at journals and picture papers idly, and waited for life to begin. And sometimes remembered the dead Miss Lovelady, saw her more vividly than any of those people she had known all her life, so that she half expected that she might walk into the room, and thought about what she had learned from her, and vowed to live by it, and was shocked and bewildered all over again by the suddenness of her dying. The letters about the subscription to the house in the country went out, batch after batch, fell onto doormats and letter-boxes of Canon and Lady and Miss, onto the doormat of Adele Hemmings and her aunt, for Georgiana believed in perseverance. In another part of the country, the child of Cecil and Isabel Moxton, a son, was born, and his mother lay and stared blankly out of the windows onto the bare lawns, and was consumed once more by the old familiar despair and terror, though of and for what she could not have said. But the baby was right enough, welcomed and made much of by the rest of them. The baby did not suffer. The week went by. Alice made elaborate plans for the dinner on Saturday night, wrote out menus and lists, and went very early to the markets, talked at length to the butcher before placing her order. She wanted to do her best, and for it all to be a challenge, for she had trained in the kitchen of a far grander house, the seat of a viscount, and was bored by cooking plain food for one or two only. Old Mrs. Grey observed Florence, saw the brightness in her eye and the set of her jaw, speculated, but did not speak. And Florence chose a new dress and 2 spring suits with hats, and spent a great deal of time and trouble, not to say money, over it. The week went by. The letters were opened, and some ignored, others destroyed, and some replied to at once, with promises, or even cheques, as is always the way. It was a tedious business. But that addressed to the aunt of Adele Hemmings lay unopened, with a good many other letters in the hall, among the mess and squalor of dust and cats. For the maid who had given in her notice and left had not been replaced. At lunch on the Friday, several people had approached him and expressed support, urged him to allow himself to be considered. Now, just after 6, he sat alone at the table in his rooms, in the light of the reading lamp. There were books open before him. An undergraduate who had read him an essay on Tyndale had just left, his feet clattering vigorously down the wooden stairs. But Thomas had hardly heard the essay, would not have known whether it had been good or bad. He had not attended to the young man at all, and he was ashamed of that, for he prided himself on being dutiful, on teaching his pupils with care, perhaps the more so because his enthusiasm, his heart and soul, were never fully engaged now. His real work was elsewhere, had been in truth for years. How many years? He thought, I am living a lie, then. I am dishonest. I am interested, yet it is no longer of first importance to me. I teach the young men Latin and Greek and New Testament studies because that is what I have always done, what I am trained to do, and perhaps I do it well enough. But it does not live, does not stir me. How much did that matter? How much was private to himself and affected no one else? He could not tell. Now he walked to the window and looked down into the quiet court, thought, and am I to be master here? Then, for a few seconds, he was gripped with passion for the idea. It burned up and consumed him. He felt a flash of pride, ambition, desire, and was taken aback, for he had never been a man interested in power or position. Yet he saw what he might do for the good, and longed to do it, to have the right, and was tempted, too, to imagine himself walking across the court, into hall, or taking his stall in the chapel, and was appalled that the idea so excited him, thought in panic that after all he did not know himself, and went then to the chapel, to kneel down in distress in the silence and darkness, hoping to still his confusion, to come to terms with his discovery of himself. He did not pray, formed no thoughts or words in his mind, merely knelt and waited, hoping, gave himself over to God, and wished in his heart that the matter had simply not arisen, that he had never been suggested as the possible master, and the calm tenor of his days had not been ruffled. But as he knelt, his eyes closed, he saw before him not any vision of himself going about in glory. That was swept away and altogether disregarded. What he saw was simply the girl again, as she stood on the stone bridge looking down into the water, that sunlit, solitary day of spring. And with the sight came, as it had come before, absolute peace, absolute contentment, absolute joy, so that the recollection of it made him tremble. Chapter 15. A group of women, a tableau in the carefully lit drawing-room, for Georgiana, like Alice, had gone to a great deal of trouble. Florence in Parma violet, falling full from a tight waist to show off her hair, her height, her figure, and Georgiana in claret with pearls, suddenly full of presence, a match for anyone. Old Mrs. Grey in black with a plaid stole, upright on the best chair. The door opened. He saw them as if arranged for a portrait, and the room as he had rarely seen it, glowing, formal. And beside the fireplace stood the girl, quite still, her hair back from her face, her dress pale, and her head was slightly turned away and in shadow. He stopped dead, and panic and confusion rose to overwhelm him. The tableau broke. Florence laughed, Georgiana stood, old Mrs. Grey's eyes were keen upon him. The girl turned her head. He saw her full face, and of course she was not the same. She was a child, after all, this cousin Kitty Moorhead, and plain and pinched and rather hollow-eyed, with a cold and her hair not loose, but tied back in a neat single plait. But taller than a child. A girl, then. A different girl. There was delicate soup and a glazed, decorated salmon. Alice's face was smooth with pride as she stood back from the table, admiring, confident. She had extra help in the kitchen, and her friend from the Spiritualist Fellowship had lent the new little parlour-maid, Ellen, the family for whom they were working being abroad. And they settled Mrs. Grey on Thomas's right. A good deal of fuss was made of her. Kitty was opposite. Looking round at the silver and the candles and the dresses of the women, at Alice and the parlour-maid, white-starched, seeing forks raised, heads bent, hearing the murmur of conversation, he thought that this is how it would be in the master's house, night after night, people dining formally, guests, elaborate meals, evening dress, and how could he bear it? He was not that sort of man. But Georgiana was enjoying herself. She would rise to it, embrace it all. He caught Florence's eye, looked away, looked across at the girl, whose head was inclined, listening to old Mrs. Grey, and he saw then that she was quite certainly the same, and being certain, felt a miasma of disappointment seep up through him. For the sight which had been so extraordinary, and the memory he had carried with him, was ordinary after all. It had merely been this plain child standing on the stone bridge. Kitty thought, Miss Cavendish is nice, but there is something not quite right. It is as though she is playing a part, not being her usual self. But nor is Cousin Florence, who is giving herself airs. For she had taken in more of human behaviour in India than she realized. She had seen airs before. And the room is so small. I had expected something much grander. And old Mrs. Grey says wise things and mad things and disturbing things, and now she is dozing. And they are all so old. For she had not seen a young person here, apart from the undergraduates, who did not seem to be very young, and some small children with a nurse bowling hoops along a path. The Reverend Mr. Cavendish was talking, for some reason, about bicycles. And now young women on bicycles, clothes flying. I was almost mown down by 2 of them yesterday, bowling along quite out of control. And for a moment she despised him and dismissed him, and would have been afraid of him too, for he seemed coldly angry, except that he spoke quite quietly. But then he looked at her across the table, and his face softened. But there, I dare say Miss Moorhead would love to bowl along the streets of Cambridge on a bicycle. And why not? It would be the very thing. You must arrange it. Have you some friends yet to bowl along with? And at once she was grateful to him for including her, for being aware of her at all. Florence said, Now, that is one of the things I must talk to you about. I have been busy this past week arranging what Kitty will do, and of course she should have friends. We will find those for her, though I am not altogether certain about bicycles. But she is here to have her education completed. That is why Eleanor has sent her. I have been looking into the matter of classes, only it all takes time, and we shall be visiting plenty of galleries and museums. She should see as many objects of beauty as possible. Do you not agree? And then just mix in intelligent society. I am sure she will find friends in due course. She will— Thomas, glancing across at Kitty again, saw her downcast, said, But I think we should let Miss Moorhead speak for herself. Kitty flushed, would have said, Oh, this and that, everything. There was so much she wanted to say, but suddenly could not, did not speak at all, and indeed was almost near to tears, without at all knowing why. Was saved by Mrs. Grey beside her, who woke from her doze. I should like some more fish. It is excellent fish. I'm very fond of fish. I was brought up on it as a girl in Scotland. and so the talk broke like a wave, swirled and changed direction, moved away from Kitty. The table was cleared for a crown roast of lamb, ludicrously frilled. He had opened the doors to 2 of the cages, so that after a while some of the small birds came out and flew up to the roof, or here and there above their heads. Kitty stood absolutely still, entranced, and at last one emerald of wing alighted for a few seconds on her outstretched hand. She said, "We have them in India. They are everywhere, but free." Disturbed by her voice, the bird flew in quick darts into a high branch of the tree that grew up through the centre of the conservatory. The others were taking coffee in the drawing-room. "Well, they are released like this as often as is practicable. But it is true, of course, and you are right, they should be free." "Oh, I was not criticizing. You must not—" No. She went to the cage of moon-yellow weavers. "These fly in the garden." "You miss home, India." "It is so strange, you see. I do not. It is as though it is not just another place, another world, but somehow not real, a dream. It is there, but not there. I can't explain." He was silent. The birds fluttered softly. Kitty turned back. "You see, I have come here because I want to learn. I chose to come. I am so pitifully ignorant. I want to know about everything. I don't want only to visit picture galleries and improving exhibitions in that genteel way, like a young lady. I want to learn about the stars and planets and Darwinism and the Greek gods and heroes and the history of religion and calculus and, oh, so much." Her peaked face was transformed, shining, eager. Moved, Thomas asked quietly, "And then?" "Oh, then, I want to do good in the world. No, you must not laugh at me." "I would not dream of it." She sat down on the circular seat that ran around the trunk of the tree, and a cloud of the birds rose up in a bright panic above her head. "I had wondered. I had known there was so much in the world. That is why I came here, to be educated. India is only tea parties and tennis and balls, which I quite like, but... and then would have been marriage, I suppose. Cousin Florence says I must meet girls of my own age, and she is right, and of course I would like to have friends, but it must not be the same." "The same?" "I mean, the same as India." "I think you can be sure that it will not." "Mrs. Gray says I should certainly meet young men too. She is very modern for such an old person." "We must all seem very old to you." "Yes." "You must take care not to lose anything." "Lose?" "Oh, freshness, I suppose I mean. Simply the joy of being young." "But Miss Lovelady was right. I have thought about it so much. Life must not be wasted." "Miss Lovelady?"
"She was a missionary on the boat. She became my friend. She was a saint, I think. I learned everything from her in a few days only. I think I am quite different because of her. And then she died. I went to her cabin, but she was dead. She had been ill. That is why she was returning to England. She didn't want to. She wanted to die in India."
Kitty looked up at him.
"Where is she?" "Where? Oh, they buried her body at sea. I know that. I watched it. But where is she?"
He knew he should say, "With God," but he could not speak.
"She was such a good woman, and she only wanted to stay and die in India. Is she in heaven? I expect that is what you would tell me."
Thomas shook his head, turned away in distress, but she sat composed, clear-eyed. After a moment he said, "We should go back to the drawing-room now. The birds must be left to roost," and led her out. In the hansom going home, old Mrs. Gray, having dozed contentedly on and off during and after dinner, was wide awake. But in between, She had watched them and missed nothing. Now she would not sleep again until the early hours. She sat very upright in the corner of the cab, the plaid stole drawn around her, said to Kitty,
"You should be dancing. That is what all young girls should do. Dance until dawn. I danced until dawn, from being 17 until I was married and left Scotland for good." "But she is not 17, Mother. She is not yet even 16. There will be time enough for all that. It was because of the dancing that Eleanor thought it best she should come here."
Mrs. Grey ignored her, turned a little to pat Kitty's hand.
"Dancing," she said again. "Dancing until dawn."
Kitty smiled, liking her, but felt dazed, heavy-headed, her cold suddenly worse again. She did not recall much of the evening just past, did not think at all, only let the movement of the cab soothe her. But she had liked very much to see the birds fluttering free, and had expected to be tongue-tied then, but was not. She realized that she had told no one else about Miss Lovelady until this night. She closed her eyes, which were smarting with cold and tiredness. And Florence dreamed, like the young girl that Kitty was, and saw herself descending a staircase, entering a room, sitting at a glittering table beside Thomas Cavendish, and knew that she was envied, that she commanded the scene. Knew she had seen his eyes admiring upon her, and now could think of no possible reason why he would not eventually marry her. Georgiana, returning from the kitchen where she had been to congratulate Alice, paused in the doorway of the drawing-room, and saw the whole evening spread out before her, felt the air still seething with their presence, their finery, their conversation. There Florence had sat, and there old Mrs. Grey, and Kitty leaning back into the shadows a little, deep in her chair. But Kitty, she thought, had done very nicely, had been quite composed and not too shy. Kitty, for all her peakiness, had made a pleasant impression. Flushed with the success of it, she wanted to hold on to the evening a little longer, to have time pause. Thomas stood beside the fireplace. The embers had slipped down low in the grate and were almost out. He said, "I have decided not to allow my name to go forward for the mastership." And the bubble of the evening burst and lay in fragments around her. She sat heavily down. "I have been foolish to entertain it. Of course the position, the way of life would not suit me. It would be wholly alien."
"If you are sure,"
she said, and could not argue, could not think of it at all. She was suddenly exhausted, barely able to form the words in her mouth.
"If you are sure."
But of course he was not. As he spoke, he was again thrown into confusion and indecision. After a while he said, "But now is not the time to discuss it." Georgiana did not move. The room felt suddenly cold. She said,
"Well, it is for you to decide, and then... But at least I'm glad we welcomed the little cousin Kitty Moorhead. It was the right thing to do."
"I hope she will not be a blue stocking." He spoke harshly. "She is certainly plain enough." And did not say anything more, and after a pause, left the room. Chapter 16. The house is quite empty, apart from the servants, of course. But they do not count. They live their own separate, alien, impenetrable lives. Louis leaves at dawn and returns as late as possible from the club, and then only to sleep here. Though there is no real sleep, the nights are scarcely less intolerably hot than the days now. Only the glare of the sun, the brightness is gone. There is relief from that. Otherwise, one lies choked by a thick blanket of humid heat under a net on the veranda, and still it is too hot. He will sweat it out here another month, and then join Eleanor in the hills for the rest of the hot season. The hills are ahead of him, a cool blue mirage. Sometimes, waking out of a turbulent half-sleep, he hallucinates the sound of running water from the endlessly trickling streams. But the worst of it this time is not the heat. He has endured that before, will do so again. You simply get on with it, ignore it. The worst is the loneliness, the absence of Kitty. He has never imagined it, nor realized the single-minded desperation with which he loves her, has always. He dreams of her every night, and she is always floating away from him, just out of reach. Once he dreamed that she was dead somewhere, and woke, flailing, calling out in terror, lay hearing the thudding of his own heart above the terrible screaming of the jackals that always fills these nights. And once, coming home early to change for dinner, he went aimlessly round the empty house and, coming into Kitty's room, had a sudden vivid recollection of doing so once before, when she had been a baby, a few weeks old. There had been no one else here. She had lain in her crib under the veil of netting, awake, eyes open, and following the slight movement of light and shadow. He had looked down at her and been so startled by her transfixed perfection, by the beauty of her head, her fingers, the mauve blue of the skin above her eyes, that he had knelt down and— What? Adored her? Prayed to her? For she had been far more to him than simply his child at that moment. Now he stands in the same doorway, looking ahead into the same room, and it is empty. Asks, where is it? That time passed. And where is she? Where is that child? And where is Kitty? Chapter 17. The weather turned mild again. The wind veered and then dropped altogether. Spring returned and would, it seemed, settle. Everything came into flower at once, daffodils and tulips together, with late blossom and early blossom, and the buds were fat and ready to burst on the horse-chestnut trees along the avenues. But it was still too early, everyone said. It could not last. It was not natural. The weather had been so peculiar lately, the seasons all anyhow. Because, of course, what people wanted was the storybook year. Everything in place and as it should be, sun all summer, snow in winter, green spring, golden autumn, just as they remembered it from childhood, when the world went aright. The grass grew and was cut for the first time, and the whole city smelled of it, of spring. The sun shone gentle on the old buildings, sparkling on the water, just as it should, and the young men rode, and the young women rounded corners, wildly, hilariously, on bicycles, skirts ballooning out. On the marshes, the spring migrants returned, and the overwinterers were long gone to their cold northern places, and the birds paired now, and began to build their secret nests, and the larks sang their seamless song, spiralling upwards until they were invisible, but still heard. And at night, in the corners of gardens, under bushes, cats yowled. Florence went about with a great purpose, fixing up this class or that private lesson, trailing Kitty in her wake, and Kitty looked about her and tried to make sense of it all, to understand what she would have to do, and grew a little less pale, and blossomed, and relaxed in the spring sunshine, saw the young women on bicycles, and was stirred with her own ambition. And from time to time some young man became aware of her in the street and glanced back, but Kitty did not notice. A week passed. Thomas, deep in work, avoided people, shut the door of his study so that Georgiana sat every evening quite alone. On Sunday he preached in the college chapel, and, as he stepped down from the pulpit, thought, and is this death? To step down and into the abyss? Is there perhaps no more than this? And shuddered, and at once turned his mind away, and listened to the Testament, and later read from it, and recited the creed, took shelter in the familiar words, but not, perhaps, comfort. But the work steadied him, and he did not look beyond it, though he was aware that he had made no decision still, that his future was uncertain, and he changed his mind daily and saw things differently. And sometimes, as he walked across the backs or down the tree-lined avenue, the spring thrust itself to his attention, and then he stopped momentarily and turned his face towards it, and the vision of the marshes and the still water came to him soothingly. And somewhere, too, not in his present consciousness, but hovering, waiting a little out of sight, out of reach, there was the picture of Kitty, the girl on the bridge. Or rather, not the picture itself. It was not so exact, so clear as that. Rather, it was the awareness that the picture would be there, and all the emotions that surrounded it, if he chose to look. But he did not. Chapter 18. In the hills, everyone dresses in the latest fashions, after the patterns sent from London and Paris. Everyone promenades, and it is wonderful. They are like flowers revived in the cool air. They sparkle in conversation, pay visits, make plans, regain appetites with new energy and vigour. And if they ignore this or that, the bazaar, the servants, and do not listen to certain noises, they can imagine that this is not India at all, but home. Home. But it is not home, and Eleanor knows it, lying on her couch in the afternoons, listless, bored, and she does not share the liveliness, the bubbling talk and excitement. For once she would rather have stayed in Calcutta with Louis, or so she thinks. But at last she must get up and dressed, and go to tea with Myrtle Pinkerton, for they seem to have become close friends, and they will talk desultorily, and sometimes it is of doing something worthwhile, perhaps starting a little morning school for the native children, or some practical classes for the women, perhaps putting on a theatrical performance in aid of the mission, a play, something with a greater intellectual substance than the usual frivolous comedies that are so popular here. Or perhaps Louis will take her for a week's holiday. A river trip up country would be stimulating. She remembers her stay in a wooden houseboat on Lake Kashmir, years ago, before Kitty was born, remembers the pink mist over the water at sunrise, and the terraced gardens rising up behind, the tranquillity of the place. And Myrtle drinks her tea and chatters to conceal her desperate longing for another child, and her unassuaged grief over the loss of the first, and brings news of a midnight picnic, with Chinese lanterns strung about the trees, and dancing, flirtations. But Eleanor thinks she will not go, says, "We have to do so much to please men. Why else would we be here at all? What else is there?" And thinks of the alternative, of Miss Hartshorn and the whole procession of sad governesses. And the days pass, and some have affairs, but nothing to be taken very seriously, and soon Louis will come, and Myrtle Pinkerton's obtuse young husband, and the hill season will be at its height, and at the end of it, the packing and the awful journey back, the winter in Calcutta. And so the world turns. Eleanor thinks, "I cannot bear it. I can no longer live like this," and resolves absolutely to return to England, to Kitty. Chapter 19. First, there was nothing. Blackness. Complete unconsciousness. And then, as though he had walked onto a stage or into a lighted room from a dark hall, there was the dream. But it did not feel like a dream. There was none of the usual strangeness about it. Everything was as usual, and as it was in life. Almost everything. It was spring, of course, the first day of spring. The sun shone, and there was even a little warmth in it, though it was so early. The catkins and the velvet willow buds were out, and the crocuses, Maundy violet, egg yolk yellow, and white upon the grass, and the delicate primroses hidden deep. Thomas walked at leisure up the avenue, slowed, taking pleasure in the sunshine. There were people about, faces upturned, smiling at one another and at total strangers, because of the beauty of the day. And so he came towards the stone bridge that curved over the water, and glancing up saw the girl standing still, poised as a bird in the sunlight, her head bent, looking down into the water. One hand rested on the stone, and her hair was tied back from her face. He stopped dead. In life she, Kitty, for of course it was Kitty, he knew that now, and yet still it was not, had stood exactly so, and worn a pale dress. But in the dream she was quite naked. He came awake in blind terror. His room was dark. Kitty, who was not Kitty, the girl, stood on the stone bridge, pale as marble. He looked and could not look, but the vision would not fade. The absolute beauty of it gripped him by the throat, choked and suffocated him. He could not move, and afterwards thought that death at that moment would have been the best, the only possible thing, would have saved all that came after. But he could only lie on his bed in the darkness, pouring with sweat from shock and terror, unable to form any coherent thought, any words, mesmerized by the vision, by the dream that did not, would not fade, as the memory of the real sight had never faded. But the two only merged together and were suffused in a clear light. He did not sleep again that night, but after some time, he had no idea of how long, switched on the lamp and made to take up the prayer book, but when his fingers touched the cover, drew back at once, and could not, dared not, only left on the light, hoping that the vision of the girl would somehow be obliterated. But it was not. It remained steady before him. The difference now was that he had no feelings of joy or peace in the presence of it, could not turn to it for warmth and comfort. There was only fear of what lay in the depths of himself, and of what it had done, might do, and fear of his own powerlessness. He would have read but could not, would have prayed and dared not. And so, gradually, the silver-grey line of dawn crept around the curtains and into the room, and he lay revealed in it. And then, for a few moments, he did sleep, a strange half-sleep, and held the dream again before him, and wonderfully the dread and horror were suspended, dissolved, and he knew only thankfulness and joy, and could rest a little in the light of them. So that opening his eyes as the sun rose and shone onto his face, briefly he was filled full of what he knew quite certainly was love, before the terror engulfed him again, and he fell down into all darkness. Above all, he must avoid encountering the real Kitty, for they were separate still, the girl on the bridge and the cousin Kitty Moorhead, though he knew them to be the same. He took to staying all day in his rooms, or at least within the boundaries of the college, and only returning after dark, and even then took a route quite different and farther round than usual. Georgiana, left alone, was concerned, bewildered, and went wearily back to the begging letters about the house in the country, and when she raised her eyes from them, supposed that it was still the question of the mastership that troubled him. For her own part, she no longer thought of it at all. Let it be. Whatever he decided, she would accept for herself. For what other choice had she?
Dear Canon X, Dear Miss de Y.
His work he undertook mechanically, listened to the essays read aloud to him by the young men, went over their translations, explained this, emended that, took refuge in Homer, soothed by the ancient story which did not touch at any point upon his real life or concerns, and the birds, late at night, for he avoided going to bed as long as possible. He sat among them for hours in the darkness, comforted. From time to time he took out his notes on the seabirds, stared at them, but wrote no more. All of that seemed far away, unrelated to him, and all day and all night went in fear, and had no idea what he might do. But the picture was always there, waiting for him to turn to it. The girl on the bridge. Kitty. Not Kitty. Chapter 20. And for the next 2 weeks the dream came again and again until he was distraught. He thought that he should talk to someone, but there was no one. It was out of the question. Once or twice he went into the chapel, but the chapel was cold and bare and empty of all help. There was nothing for him there. And the night came, and after the nights the beautiful sunlit days, full of birdsong and the greening of all the trees. It was full spring, but he scarcely knew it. In the end, there had to be some resolution. It was after 9 o'clock in the evening, quite dark, the air soft and smelling sweetly of grass. He had dined alone in his rooms, spoken to no one. He came out of the shadow of the college. Walking briskly as he did, he would be home within minutes. But at the top of the street he veered off suddenly, cutting down first one and then another side lane, keeping close to the high walls, until he came out again in a different part of the town, and after 100 yards slowed his pace. There was no moon, and yet he was afraid of being seen. Once or twice a cab went by, and he shrank towards the hedge. And then he saw the house. The curtains had not been drawn, and the lamps were lit, and shone softly out of the wide windows of the drawing-room. At first, and for some time, there was no one. The house stood alone, the room empty. Thomas stood motionless on the pavement, not thinking, not knowing why he was there, or what he expected to happen. No one walked past him. If they had done so, he had not imagined what he might do. Somewhere a dog yapped. Again, a door closed. And then a shadow crossed the light, and looking up at the window, he saw her. She was standing in profile beside the lamp. Her hair was drawn back. He could not see her face. But after a few seconds, she turned, and then he did see her. And at that moment, Kitty and the girl on the bridge merged and became one. Reality and memory, his dream and the picture before him were now the same. He stood transfixed, and he knew love, pure and absolute, as he had never known it in his life before, so that he struggled to catch his breath. And then he could only half run, stumbling away, and after a long time found himself walking fast down one of the straight roads that led between mean, dark little houses, and so out of the town towards the open country.
This is the end of CD 5. The book continues on CD 6. CD 6.
Chapter 21. For in the open country he could breathe again. He felt better with space on every side of him. The cottage in Warwickshire was in the country, and far further from any town. But that was not open. It was closed in. The woods came down to the house and seemed to press upon it to drain the air. Miss Hartshorn felt choked, stifled when she stepped outside, to stand for just a few minutes at the front door, or briefly into the garden. Her lungs seemed to fill up with moisture. Her head ached dully. But she had scarcely been outside these past weeks, had been nowhere at all. And now, tonight, her friend Marjorie Pepys was dying. It had come so soon. Once they had made plans, discussed what they might do together in retirement, where they might venture. But the plans had been shelved, had not been referred to at all. They had done nothing. Everything had become subservient to Miss Pepys's dying. Day after day, Amelia Hartshorn had woken to the recollection of it, and to notice, as she had never done before, the darkness, the claustrophobia of the cottage. They might have talked. There was much they could have said. But they did not. They said almost nothing, for talk exhausted Marjorie Pepys, and in the end, where was the point of words? And so they sat on opposite chairs across the little crowded room, and later Miss Pepys lay on the sofa, and at last in her bed, and dozed, and from time to time opened her eyes, which watered constantly, but saw almost nothing. I should read to her, Amelia Hartshorn thought, and gathered piles of books from shelves about the house, and set them on the table beside her. Now she might read again all those writers they both loved, and which she had remembered in India, Stevenson, Thackeray, Shakespeare, Lamb, but did not. Sometimes picked a book up, turned a page, but could take nothing in, and Miss Pepys slept and was far away, only watched guiltily, helplessly, the slow business of her dying. Except that it was not slow, it had been quick. So quick, she had scarcely arrived home, had not been given time to get used to it, to come to terms. And how long had Marjorie had? And now, tonight, suddenly, it was here. Death. It was almost over. She had pulled her chair a little away, towards the window. The lamp was low and threw shadows onto the ceiling, and in the light of it, Marjorie Pepys's face was tallow, dry. Through the window, slightly ajar, came the night smell of the garden, the trees, the river, and from the wood, the night sounds. She remembered the horror of the night sounds in India, and how she had longed, prayed to be back here, longed for the owl and the barking vixen and the sound of rain sussing down through the leaves. From the bed, a stir, a half sigh, half rasp in the throat. Words? Miss Hartshorn went to her. The bedclothes were scarcely raised. She lay flat as a leaf or a sheet of paper beneath them. She might have had no bones or flesh at all. The skin was transparent over her wrists. Bone gleamed through, bluish white. She was a stranger, unknown, no longer familiar, yet alive. The pulse still beat in the chords of the neck. The noise again. Words. Yes. Amelia Hartshorn bent her head. Open the window wider. She did so, and the breeze blew in, drifting the curtains about. Now her eyes were wide open and very blue, bright again, as they had always been, and struggling to see. Now she smiled. Miss Hartshorn touched her hand, dry as a moth's wing. She thought it might crumble to dust beneath her fingers. And then she wanted to cry out, "Why did you not tell me? Why did you not write? Was it to punish me? I would have come home. I would never have gone." Should never. The voice came very clearly, startling her in the quiet room. "We are barren," Marjorie Pepys said. And then her eyes closed, and for a long time there was silence. She seemed scarcely to breathe. It is death, Miss Hartshorn thought, and felt a leap within her of something like dread and excitement mingled. Death. But the night drew on, and death lingered outside the door, and in the end the lamp flickered and failed, and so she sat on in the darkness, beside the friend she no longer knew, and thought of India again, but without feeling, and once or twice of Kitty, but without interest. It was not until 5 or so that death came at last into the room, along with a chill, damp breath of air from off the river, and the first sour parchment light of morning. "And the window is always left open, even in the depths of the harshest winter." Mrs. Gray's fingers darted in and out, the crochet needle cocked at an angle.
for the soul to escape and to fly away from the body at the moment of death.
Kitty was half asleep, curled in the armchair beside her, like a small child listening to the last story before bed. For at last she had settled, after wandering aimlessly about the drawing-room or simply standing still beside the window close to the lamp. It was the evenings that dragged and were dull here.
Have people seen the soul at death?
Dart, dart, dart.
Oh, many have. Those with the second sight. What sort of people are they?
It is very common in the Highlands.
What have they seen?
Some see a bird, some see a moth-like thing or a wee bright insect.
Mother, you should not fill her head with your tales. Kitty has come here to be educated, to have her mind sharpened.
Florence was writing a letter to Eleanor Moorhead, mainly about Kitty. But her voice was mild. She was unable to rebuke anyone or to be seriously irritated about anything. She felt warm, smug with hope and anticipation. She had assured herself, past all doubting now, that Thomas Cavendish would marry her.
I have arranged 2 classes in history and the history of art, with some ladies here who have been most highly recommended, the Mrs. Lewis. They are sisters, and have taught in schools, and are very widely travelled, and she is to have mathematics in a class with 3 other young ladies. She seems very interested in scientific subjects, but I am told that the classics should have priority.
She glanced up again at her mother and Kitty, huddled in chairs together, gleeful with talk.
Thought it is good for them both, for the old to be with the young. And all the time I have something of my own, another life to look forward to at last.
And she held the secret of it close to her, and drew warmth and strength from it, fed off it, as she bent her head again, smiling, to the letter. He sat in the darkness, on a stone at a crossroads. And the house in the country, the house being made ready for the fallen women, was no more than a mile away, if he had known it. It rained a little, damping his hair and the shoulders of his coat, but he was scarcely aware of it, or why he was here, or what he might possibly do. But the night sounds, the open air all around him, made him long to be out on the marshes, sitting silently on the dark water in the punt, or on the deck of the houseboat, watching, waiting. And he remembered his last time there, and looking back, saw it as a time not only of peace and utter contentment, but of innocence too, like some paradise before the fall. And he longed desperately for that time now, that absolute lightness of heart. And he would go, get ready tonight, and be there this time tomorrow. He stood up, began to walk, except that he could not. He might never go there again. He was another man now. But then an image came to him of Kitty, looking out across the water, pointing, turning to speak to him, and he grasped at it. His mind raced ahead. He would take her there. She would see it all, be with him in that place, as he knew that she would surely be with him in dreams, night and day, if he went alone, and he walked faster down the empty road, in thrall to his fantasy. It was only an hour or more later, reaching the first of the houses, that he stopped and came back to himself and the harsh reality of things. The clouds cleared, letting out the moon, a half-moon, waning, not bright, but giving a little light to light his way, as the old clocks chimed 2, and he walked more slowly now, dazed, as though he had been knocked out and come to, half-conscious. And in the darkness around him there were still sounds, and others walked here and there, in the lanes and alleyways and down the avenues and across the grass that led to the river and the weir, but he heard none of them, saw nothing. Did not see Adele Hemmings as she walked, maggot-white and naked, between the bushes and undergrowth bordering the houses higher up the avenue, her mind a mass of fragments of strange, bewildered, unrelated thoughts. Georgiana, awake in her room, heard his footsteps and the closing of the door at last, and was relieved of her immediate anxiety that he had not yet come home, and yet not relieved at all, but deeply troubled and unable to speak of it, and so remained drearily awake, hearing the wind, if it was the wind, rustle and stir the branches and bushes in their garden and other gardens along the quiet streets. Chapter 22. Late April, and the first swallows seen dipping and skimming over water, the first cuckoos heard, and a light breeze blows the apple blossom prettily down to lie in soft heaps on grass and path, fresh for half a day before curling, browning, scattering away. In the gardens of the Women's College the lilac buds, horse-chestnuts burst and flare, and the college tortoise, newly emerged from deep beneath soil and stones, stalks warily, legs like stilts, across the lawn. The young women, skirts hitched, were playing croquet.
There is croquet in India, at the club.
Kitty sat in a canvas chair on the terrace beyond French windows. They were taking tea with Thea Pontifex.
Oh, but then of course you must play.
Thea sprang up.
Come, let me take you over. Let me introduce you.
Kitty looked to where the group parted, swaying, laughing. Already shadows had begun to lie along the grass. She thought,
and I will come here. I will. Be like that, independent, happy, learning, among friends. It is what I want to work for.
And followed Thea. She is pretty after all, and she is almost a young woman, Florence thought, watching, leaning back in her chair. Though once among them, shaking hands, talking, Kitty was still slighter, younger-looking, and somehow frailer. For the young women of the college had already fought battles and emerged triumphant, and were confident, secure in their place here. She remembered her own recent passion to take up some course of study and belong in this place, and with surprise, amusement even, all that was far away now. But Kitty, yes, Kitty would do very well here, and she would be more than happy to put all her energies and powers of persuasion into accomplishing that, to live this life through her. Kitty held the mallet, laughing. They were deferring to her, welcoming, kind. The ball cracked forward, went anywhere. The group parted and reformed. There was more laughter. The tortoise had reached the rockery. Returning, sitting beside her again, Thea Pontifex said,
Kitty must be properly taught. She is a clever girl. Little classes here and there will certainly not be enough, if these plans for her are serious.
Mallet clocked against ball again, raising a small cheer.
I have made a start on arranging things for her, but it is clear that I simply know too little about the real requirements. I see that now. Kitty must be given every opportunity, be guided in every way. Her parents have given you carte blanche?
Her parents? Florence paused, remembering the rather vague letters.
Her parents perhaps see it more as a way of passing the next year or so, until she has grown up. Yes, I dare say they have the usual horror of female education. But I do not, and Kitty is in my charge here. I am to make the decisions as I see fit. And she is clever, you say so yourself. I have said that she seems to be alert and intelligent. Of course, I have as yet no proof. And keen to study. Yet I doubt very much if she has any idea of what study is. Then she will learn, and that is precisely why we are here, why we have come to you.
A jubilant shout from the croquet game, and Kitty darted, slender, eager to retrieve the ball from among the lavender bushes bordering the far side of the lawn. Thea Pontifex turned her head away from them to look again at Florence.
There is something I have to tell you.
The game was resumed.
It is that I have become engaged to be married.
Before Florence could comment, she said quickly, "I shall leave the college at the end of the summer. Of course, I shall give all the help I can to Kitty until then, and think of who might advise you more closely, but I myself will not be here. It seems right that you should know. You and I are such old friends. We have not yet spoken of it to very many people." For a few seconds, Florence sat in silence. The garden, the graceful burgeoning trees, the figures on the lawn unseen before her. She felt anger and bitter envy rise up like bile within her, and she stared at Thea, plain, dowdy, studious Thea, a friend from her youth, but always, until now, somehow inferior, and to be patronized and pitied. She scarcely attended to what else was being said. Thea's talk of the future, the husband-to-be, a widower, father of one of the young women, a move to live in Sussex, in a village beneath the downs, other stepchildren, only felt, after the wave of anger and bitterness, a new determination, bright and strong as steel with regard to her own situation. The croquet game was quite suddenly over, and Kitty, with two of the young women, coming towards them, stepping onto the terrace from the grass. Florence said brightly, "Kitty, our plans are thwarted and all in disarray, but for the best of all reasons. Miss Pontifex is to be married." A buzz of interest, exclamation among the girls, and under cover of it, quite quietly, Florence said, "And I, in my turn, though no one must know of it yet, I expect to have news of that kind myself before too long," and felt her heart leap and quicken, as if the act of speaking it out loud must surely make it be so. No one must know it, but glancing up she saw that of course Kitty had heard, and was looking at her, taken by surprise, and perhaps in some bewilderment. Florence returned the child's gaze, eyes steady and defiant upon her. Chapter 23. There had never been a spring like it. Everyone said so. On May Day, the lawns and gardens were crowded, straw hats came out, the young men sprawled on the grass or else took to the river, and some young women, too, giggling in groups, delighted with themselves. And some of them, being kind, invited Kitty. There was to be a picnic among bluebells under the trees. Kitty wore white, with a silk sash, her hair down. Temperatures neared 80, or so it was believed. Now Thomas thought of no one and nothing else. It was as if he had gone mad. He had seen her only 3 times. They could scarcely be said to have spoken. He went out, wandered desperately among the young people, looking, but turned away and retreated in shame just as he was very near and might have seen her, laughing, beautiful, among the other picnickers on the grass. On the staircase, going towards the library, the Dean. "Cavendish, I am very glad indeed to see you. I have been a little concerned." It was dim here, cool, private, but still he turned away his face. Daubeny peered. "I should very much like to talk. Will you come and see me? Will you dine?" "I have been finishing a piece of work. Of course, but there are things to discuss, just in a friendly way." "Yes." "Tomorrow we would be alone." He looked round, panicked. He did not know what day tomorrow was. "Thank you. Yes. Yes. You are not unwell?" "Unwell? No." He turned. "I have a tutorial, if you will excuse me." He reached his room, closed the door, stood, trying to focus, to come to his senses. Unwell? No. Yes. Was he? What was he? The vision rose before him again. Kitty on the stone bridge, looking down into the water, her dress pale, hair back from her face, and his only thought was that he must see her. Perhaps then, somehow, he would be sane again, and This would be over. He stood at the window, looking down onto the quiet courtyard. Wagtails bathed, fluttering about in the shadow of the fountain. But all the people were gone, to the gardens, to the river. He rested his head on the glass and thought nothing. Nothing. Kitty. Chapter 24. It was spring, but it was almost summer. May blossom curded the hedgerows. At dawn, mist wreathed ghostly over the river and far beyond. At dusk, the swifts, newly returned, soared around all the towers of the town. And the sun shone. Every day was cloudless. Every day was hot. Florence had planned the trip to London, to St. Faith's Shelter. They were to go on a Thursday, returning by Saturday evening, and Georgiana, anxious, preoccupied, would go, not having the energy to do otherwise. They were sitting in the deep shade of the copper beech.
But it is Latin and Greek which are most important, and she has done neither, of course. She will have to make up a very great deal of work. Yes, and Scripture, I dare say those should all go together. Oh, yes. But we have so far been unsuccessful. Perhaps one of the schools. Should she not simply go to school?
But having come this far, Florence would go further. Looking away from Georgiana, watching a blue-tit dart into the bushes and at once out again, said,
I would welcome advice. But you have taken advice, Miss Pontifex. But this is not her field. Thea is a historian. Besides, her thoughts are elsewhere. She no longer seemed very interested or committed. Ah, might you not mention it to your brother? Or perhaps I should simply write him a letter.
A breeze rippled the leaves above them, so that for a few seconds they were dappled with sunlight, the detail from some painting, 2 women on wicker chairs under the great tree. Brother, Georgiana thought of him, saw him. His face suddenly older, strained, grey, and almost wept with her own helplessness, shut out, and remembered in childhood days when he had locked his room against her, and she had sat down on the other side of the door, close up to it, touching the cold wood with her hand, leaning her head against it, hating him to be within, private among his own things, unreachable in his own thoughts. Loved him now as then, surreptitiously and in silence. Florence said,
I feel sure that he would be able to recommend someone, solve the problem at once.
Yes, though she scarcely heard. Looking at her, sensing her preoccupation, Florence thought,
it is illness, perhaps,
or simply old age already, and felt concerned, but knew that whatever it was could not touch her. She herself was immune, invincible. The bird, through accident or its own stupidity, had caught its leg in the door of the cage. It was not badly injured. It would not die, he thought, unless of fright. Thomas stood in the middle of the conservatory, cradling the soft, bright-feathered thing in his hands. Its eyes gleamed bead-bright. Coming to the doorway, Georgiana watched and felt excluded again, an intruder here. His face, looking closely at the bird, seemed younger, unlined and tender, but catching sight of her, he frowned, shaking his head, and so she turned away and waited in the outer study, among the other birds, those that were dead, or present only in image, and to which she could do no harm. After some time he joined her. I am sorry, you wanted to speak to me?
You are dining in college?
I am dining with the dean.
You are always rushing away. I feel I have to make an appointment to see you. You never settle now.
It is full term. You should know how much there is to be done.
Yes.
I shall try not to be late back.
But then you will be tired and preoccupied, or I shall be tired, and so it will not do.
Georgiana.
In any case, it was scarcely important. It was simply something about young Kitty Moorhead.
Pain flared. Pain or pleasure, anxiety, hope, dread.
Florence is trying to find tutors for her, and just now it is Latin and Greek, and Scripture. I am to ask if you might suggest someone suitable, that is all."
For a second he paused, his thoughts turbulent, flailed about among them, then abruptly turned and going out of the room said, "I am afraid I am already late, and I could not possibly advise about teaching at that level for a young girl. What are you thinking of? How could I?" Georgiana stared after him in the wake of his ill temper, bewildered, surprisingly near to tears. And the Dean had almost nothing to say, and gleaned nothing at all from him. It was a fruitless, awkward evening. There were too many silences. Thomas was home a little after 10 o'clock. The house was already in darkness. He went at once to the conservatory, but the injured bird was hours dead. Daubeny sat alone over a last glass of port. But after all, there had been nothing more definite at any point than a few words privately spoken, some opinions canvassed, nothing irrevocable in any way. It would be perfectly easy, if it became necessary, to go back to the beginning and start again. He thought, "I have failed with Cavendish, or failed Cavendish," but did not know which or how, only drained his glass and turned down the lamps and went to bed. In a narrow cobbled side lane, leading down to the weir, a small church tucked sideways into the wall, and behind it someone had half made a garden, though much of the time it was overgrown. You pushed aside trailing branches and clambering brambles, trees arched meeting overhead now to form a green shade, roses clung to the wall. In February there were snowdrops, in May bluebells and lily of the valley. The old gravestones leaned between. There was a stone seat. He sat on it in the late afternoon and thought about love. But he knew nothing of love, or not of this kind. How could he know? He was blind, stumbling forwards in an unfamiliar landscape. For what had he loved in his life? Places, he thought at once. The house in Ireland, and the low shoreline, and the violet shadow of the mountain, sky and sea, the marshes and mudflats and water stretching to the North Sea, his days alone there, the island, the geese flying, the birds always. His mother he had loved passionately when small, but the passion had faded. Nana Quinn, he supposed. He could scarcely remember. He did not think at all of Georgiana. His work, did he love that? Or was it merely satisfaction? His God? No, his religion was not of that kind. But he loved the cadences of Scripture, the old words. None of these things counted for anything at all. He saw that now. He had never thought that he might love a woman, if this obsession was love. And how was he to know? He had no possible way of telling. Marriage he had considered, but always in the abstract. He saw it as necessary for some, for companionship and the establishment of families, and as the way women were provided for, but he had never felt the need of it. He had watched the years of patient, single-minded devotion of his friend Cecil Moxton in bewilderment, knowing that what he watched was love of the purest kind, but had never for one moment understood it. And the case of a young man like Eustace Partridge, who had ruined his life because of the weakness of the flesh, had merely repelled him, and the waste of it had made him angry. Now he sat watching a blackbird scurry close to the earth, head dipping, and knew himself to be utterly changed. New joy felt as a lightness, a quickening in his breast, thinking of Kitty, seeing her in his mind's eye. But love? The blackbird rose abruptly and flew low to the ground for a few yards before settling on one of the lichened gravestones. A breeze blew, parting the leaves. Love. He got up and left the churchyard and began to walk quickly up the lane, away from the river.
You will have tea, of course.
That would be kind. Thank you. It is very hot.
I will ring in a moment. Hot, yes, unseasonably so, do you not think? They say it has been in the 80s. Surely that cannot be natural. It is only early May. My mother says that we are going to have a glorious summer, the hottest summer ever. Oh, do please sit down.
I wonder how one would know.
No?
Ever that we are to have the hottest summer ever.
Yes, I do see. But in any case, it is only mother, liking to pretend that she has second sight. Highland blood and so on. It makes her feel interesting. I dare say the weather will break soon, and then we shall have rain for a month.
It shows no sign of breaking yet.
Oh, yes, and you are hot. I will ring for tea at once.
She rang.
Of course, Kitty does not find it hot at all after India.
His heart lurched. Kitty. But she was not here.
This would be a day in the cold season, she says, and even then it is never so fresh. The air is never so clear there. She is looking well, do you not think? Our climate agrees with her.
Yes, I am sure it does. She seems... Yes. For a moment he struggled, her gaze upon him. She sat on a small chair, which was upholstered in eau de Nil, on the other side of the room. Her dress was a deeper shade of the same green. She had placed herself rather carefully, but he was unaware. He looked down at the carpet, counted rosebuds on the intricate border, felt panic.
It has come, Florence thought. It is now. Now he will surely ask.
The door opened on the maid, bearing tea. And so tea was poured and drunk, and a Dundee cake cut, and he felt more than ever out of place in this room, and looked, in desperation, at oil portraits that hung from the walls, and china in decorative cabinets, and shelves of the works of the English poets, as if for help. Found none. And Florence spoke only a little, a few words, and then fell into silence, looking across at him. Old Mrs. Grey, it seemed, was resting. And Kitty? He said at last, I understand from my sister that you are in need of a tutor for Miss Moorhead, that you have had some problem.
Oh, for Latin and Greek, she said almost without interest. I had forgotten that I mentioned it to Georgiana.
I gather that she has studied neither subject.
Oh, no.
But someone could be found, I am quite sure. I would be willing to speak to one of my pupils if... but perhaps you would not think that suitable.
Really, you need not trouble. Georgiana suggested that Kitty should go to school. Well, she will not do that. Her parents do not seem to wish it, but I am sure a schoolmistress can be found. I have thought of a way round it, and that is... I shall advertise. But it is all very trivial. Really, you are not to concern yourself.
But I would want to concern myself. She looked up, hearing an edge to his voice. He said, She must have the best tuition from the beginning. Perhaps you will at least allow me to see any applications you may receive. So much harm may be done by bad teaching. Florence stood up and crossed to the window.
She is only a girl after all, she said, with a slight laugh. I dare say all this will come to nothing in the end. She is not one of your clever young men.
Nevertheless, Florence did not reply, nor turn back to him. There was silence again. He had no idea what else he might do, only sat staring down at the empty teacup and saucer in his hands, a cold, dead misery numbing him through. He had come only in the hope of seeing her, and he had not seen her, and so he must go back to college, he supposed, or home, or else to walk without purpose about the lawns and paths. It did not matter where. Florence's back was stiff and straight as a rule. He set down his cup, rose heavily, and hearing him, she too felt the cold, leaden weight of disappointment. He had said nothing. But why then had he come?
But he was simply embarrassed. This would not be easy for a man like him. Of course, he would come again.
She turned, having reassured herself, smiled brilliantly. In the hall, she waited as he took up his stick, drew on his gloves, and tried to choose the words to say.
"I will teach her. Let her come to me. Let her—"
but could not have spoken them. And hearing the sounds, the maid came down the passage to open the front door. He had almost left. And then footsteps running, and she was there, on the staircase, and seeing them below, stopped, said,
"Oh, hello. Good afternoon."
He looked up at her. Kitty flushed a little with confusion, as well as the excitement of running.
"I am going out to tea in an undergraduate's rooms. That is, a lady, a woman undergraduate, of course. I have suddenly made a whole lot of friends. Isn't it fun? And they have introduced me to others."
She jumped down the last 2 or 3 stairs, hair loose, flying out. He was transfixed by her, his heart pounding. Then she looked at him, and her face became quite grave. She said quietly,
"But you must not think badly of me. I am not becoming completely frivolous. I have not forgotten what I said to you. You must not think that I did not mean it."
"No, I did not think it."
"It is just that the weather is so very beautiful, but I am to study. It is all being arranged. There is so much I am to learn."
It seemed to Thomas that they stood looking at one another in the dim hall, for hours, then for a lifetime, for no time, yet only for a split second, and that no one else was there, no one else existed in the world. Then Florence stepped forward, spoke, the maid put her hand up to her cap, and so the pieces fell into a different, duller pattern, and he had gone, the usual politenesses said. It was over. He walked very quickly until he was out of sight of the house, and then stopped for breath, and clutched at the wall, and held on to it, dizzy and trembling violently. And Kitty took her bag and her wrap too, in case the evening grew chilly. But it would not, of course. It would not. It was a perfect early summer evening. Only Florence insisted, and indeed was rather sharp. And by then the friends had arrived. 3 of the young women. She was swept away by them. She was happy. And later reminded, for some reason, of the scene in the hall, of Thomas Cavendish, felt a sudden warm impulse of friendliness towards him, and even of complicity, as though they shared some secret from which all others were excluded, though if she had been asked, she could not have explained the feeling or justified it. And then, the afternoon, the new friends, the sudden gaiety of it all overtook her. Coming down after her rest, old Mrs. Grey sensed the air in the drawing-room, sour with dashed hopes and disappointment. Florence stood looking out of the window again.
"I suppose you want to have tea. Ina has just now cleared away, but of course she can make some more." "No, I shall not want to trouble her." "Don't be ridiculous, mother. It is what they are for. There is no question of troubling."
She rang the bell irritably, and then, when the maid did not come at once, stalked out and into the hall. But in the hall, stopped, and saw it all again. Saw Kitty careering down the stairs, hair flying, saw her stop, saw Cavendish look up at her. Saw on his face an expression she had never seen before, but could not understand or put a name to. Chapter 25. In the hills, Myrtle Pinkerton has a flirtation, and perhaps it will become an affair. But such things usually remain quite innocent here. And Eleanor watches and is shocked or envious, but at any rate withdraws her friendship a little, and so is even more lonely herself, and desperate for Kitty. She goes to church a great deal and volunteers to organize a sale of handiwork in aid of blind native children. Makes plans to go home. On the plain, Louis sweats and works and drinks too much. Is lonely. and wakes in the hot nights out of wild, terrible dreams to find that he is weeping, and tries to bring Kitty's face to mind for comfort, and cannot. One morning, very early, Eustace Partridge walks 4 miles in the chill pale mist that lies over the fields before the sun has risen to catch the first train that rattles with milk churns through the quiet countryside to Cambridge. And his young wife wakes in the empty room, not knowing where he might have gone or why, but by now she is used to that. No one opens the shutters of the house in Norfolk, but a little sunlight finds an entrance here and there, and cuts thin and bright as a blade across the dusty floor. It is dawn when Adele Hemmings slips home from her solitary spying upon lovers, and hearing voices that speak only to her from the moon and stars, prophesying, urging. Miss Hartshorn clears cupboards and drawers and wardrobes of her friends' clothes, and parcels them to dispatch them to the workhouse or to Poor Relief, and looks up from time to time and out of the bedroom window, which is still open, as Marjorie Pepys wanted the night of her death, but thinks nothing, dares not dwell upon the past or contemplate the future. Only occasionally some scene from India flashes unbidden across her mind, surprising her in its detail and brilliance. For 2 days the weather dulled slightly. There was cloud and a little drizzle. But then it passed and was forgotten. The sun rose higher, and May bloomed on in its full glory of lilac and laburnum, the last of the hawthorn and the first of the elder, and all the fields golden with cowslips and dandelions, thick as stars. And the flat blades of iris with lavender-blue heads stood tall against the stone walls in every college garden. Georgiana, opening the windows and coming out onto the lawn, saw a cat pounce hard upon one of the first fledglings, and screamed at it and flapped at it and called to Alice, and cleared the sad mess of blood and bones and feathers hastily away before her brother should return home. But Thomas sat on a bench under the great branching chestnut tree beside the river, and thought, Kitty, 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 in hope and love and dread, and nothing else held any interest for him or had any meaning at all. Chapter 26. He wanted to be with her. The thought of it possessed him completely. There was nothing else. Kitty. But the opportunity came quite soon, and presented itself entirely naturally. He had the name of a possible tutor in Latin and Greek, the unmarried daughter of a fellow of another college, who lived at home and cared for an invalid mother, and longed for stimulus, distraction, and younger company, and would be entirely suitable. And, of course, he could have written a brief note, would have done so under normal circumstances, but nothing was normal now. Mid-afternoon of an early June day, the avenue was very quiet, some blinds down here and there. It was still hot. The sun still shone and shone. The chime sounded far away in the recesses of the house. He must simply hand in the address, see no one. He had no reason to go inside. The maid opened the door, and Kitty was behind her in the hall. He thought that his heart, beating so violently, might erupt out of his chest. He held his hands tightly around his stick and behind his back, because he could not control their trembling. In the drawing-room, everything was in order, formal, neat. The clock ticked into the silence. He thought, how dull it must be for her here, with the 2 women, how uninteresting after life in India, though he had no real idea of how that life might have been.
I am so sorry. There is only me. My cousin is unwell. She has a bad migraine headache and is in bed, and Aunt Dozy is always resting at this time of day.
Aunt Dozy?
Mrs. Gray. Her name is Theodosia. Don't you think that very romantic sounding? but not very Scottish, which of course she is, and can never forget it. I wonder where the name came from."
He looked at her in bewilderment. She was a child, chattering on, trying to behave in the correct adult way with an unexpected visitor. A child, that was all. But she was Kitty, and her flesh, her hair, the bones of her fingers as they rested on a chair back, seemed to him rare and amazing, the most precious he had ever seen. She was more beautiful than angels. Kitty. He did not believe that anyone before this time, this day, could so have loved another being.
"So I am here alone, almost alone, and all my new friends are doing their examinations. They cannot attend to me just now."
He said, and heard his own voice sound strangely into the room. "I have the name of someone who might perhaps be suitable to tutor you in the classics. Your cousin asked me for advice. It is a Miss Unsworth. I am slightly acquainted with her father." He did not know how to order the words aright, how to speak to her at all. He was aware of sounding unnatural, false, stiff.
"Oh, you are very kind. Where does she live? When might I see her? I am very anxious to begin. You see, it is my aim to be an undergraduate. I have been quite inspired by the friends I have made, those Miss Pontifex introduced me to. I long to live in the college and have people of my own age all around me, and a room of my own. Oh, but I do realize how much I have to do, how ignorant I am, but I intend to succeed."
Her face was bright, earnest. Kitty, he thought, and almost groaned aloud. Kitty, Kitty.
"And now you have gone to so much trouble for me, and you are such an important man and so very busy, and I will go to see Miss
Unsworth, Miss Rose Unsworth."
"Yes. Oh, do forgive me. I should have... May I offer you some tea, or rather a glass of sherry? I know that is the correct thing to offer a college fellow. Sherry is what they drink all the time."
She flushed, seeing him smile.
"Only, I do not mean that—"
"Of course you do not, and you are quite right about the sherry, on the whole, that is to say. But I will not take any now, thank you." But at once wished that he had accepted, needing to stay here with her, to be in this room. So he would have tea instead, when she offered it again. But she forgot to do so. Faintly, from the street, the cry of "Rack and bone! Rack and bone!"
And then she said, "My cousin was going to ask if you would perhaps show us around your college one day. I have only seen any of them from the outside, of course, from the gardens, and once I stood in the great court of Trinity, and we walk across the backs. The women's college is really rather new and very different. There are no pictures or treasures of any kind."
"Is that what you would like? To look around the inside of a college, to see pictures and treasures?" He would take them, of course, show them what there was to show, for it would mean he might be with her. It was all he wanted. He would invite them. He said, not knowing that he was going to do so, "Then let us go. You have nothing else to do? It seems rather quiet for you here."
"Now? This afternoon?"
"Now, this afternoon. That is, if Mrs. Bowering—"
"Oh, no. It will be perfectly all right. She would not be able to come, and I had better not disturb her. She is really very unwell. Her headaches last 2 or 3 days sometimes, I am told. She has to have the blinds down and absolute quiet. Shall I need a coat? No, I think it is warm enough. I will just tell the maid to say where I have gone."
The door opened and closed, stirring the still air, shifting the curtains as she went, hair flying out from her shoulders. He swayed slightly, reached quickly for a chair, thought, "Kitty, Kitty, Kitty, Kitty," thought nothing else at all, was only carried on the tide of it, and did not at all consider what he was about to do, the propriety or not. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered. He wanted to show her the treasures of the created world, And besides, he was old. He was 54 years old and a senior fellow, a clergyman. It was perfectly appropriate and acceptable that he should escort her. The clock ticked on into the silence. He was never to forget any of it. For the rest of his life he would remember everything, in the smallest detail. But perhaps that afternoon most of all, for on that day it seemed his life began. Before it, he realized, there had been nothing at all. And after it, for however many years there were, less than nothing. But that was a different matter. Such paintings, such treasures as the college had, he showed her. They took a cab there from the stand at the corner. Closing his eyes, even 30 years later, he could see the hairs on the thick neck of the man who drove it, the seam of grease on his collar. There was the great picture in the chapel, the Adoration. He took her to that, first of all, stood, watching her eyes become used to the dimness and focus upon it, trace the figures one by one, the potentates, the shepherds, the Madonna, the waxen child, and her own face was grave and still as those portrayed there, and the light from the candles beside the altar gave it the same fine painted sheen. He could scarcely breathe. After a moment he pointed to the kneeling figure, the rapture on the uplifted, worshipping face. Kitty nodded slightly. Coming out of the coolness and the gloom, they laughed, freed in some way by the brightness and the warmth of the sunshine that blazed in their faces.
"It is very beautiful. It is very grand," Kitty said. "And how old the child looks, and how wise." She paused. "But I did not very much care for the chapel. The atmosphere is so sad and crushing. I felt very insignificant there."
Kitty, he thought. And here she was. He wanted to cry out to the four walls. Kitty, Kitty, Kitty. Then there were the corridors and the staircases, the great hall, the gallery, the portraits, the cases and vaults of silver, the chained Bible, King Henry's library, the Elizabethan chest, more staircases, more corridors. It seemed to him dull as the tomb. On a narrow landing she half knelt to peer through a slit of window onto the fellow's garden below.
"Like looking through the wrong end of a telescope."
Otherwise, inside the old building she scarcely spoke, and when she did, almost whispered. Her face was very composed, very grave, as solemn as the waxen child, as wise. She had coiled her hair up beneath her hat. Once, as she half turned, he saw the skin of her long neck, pale and almost transparent, with a sheen as on a circle of honesty. He stared, his mouth dry. But then, coming out from the shadow of the buildings, and under the arch into the full sunlight again, and the garden and paths that led down to the river, suddenly she smiled, and took off her hat, and shaking her head, let her hair fall onto her neck and shoulders, down her back, all anyhow, and skipped once or twice, turning to say something to him, eyes dancing. And he felt it too. The shadow fell away from him and rolled off his back. He put the buildings, the walls, the books and the paintings and the treasures, all behind him, and forgot them. They were nothing. They were as dust. And so, laughing too, he went beside her towards the river which ran between the banks, sparkling in the sun, and where the young men in boaters punted and rowed, and the young women sat together, smiling, and glided with pleasure under the bridges, into the rippling shadows and out again. And the moorhens and coots circled around and about them, and the willows trailed gentle strands into the water. He looked down at her as she stood beside him, holding her straw hat between her hands, against her dress. He said, "Have you been on the river yet?" Her face, upturned to his, was the face of a young child, and so they went, walked down to where the boats were below the bridge, and took one. He had not rowed on this river for more than 30 years. Getting in, she reached out her hand to balance, but he would not have touched it, drew back a little. But the boatman was there. She turned instinctively to him to hand her in. And then, as she settled on the cushions, leaning back a little, put the straw hat back on her head, and her face was grave again and quite serene, looking down at the water, and above the water to the bank, and the bridges, and over and beyond them to where the towers and stone walls soared to the sky. He thought only, this time is the most precious there has ever been. All moments have led to this. All moments end here, end now, and then thought nothing more, and there was no more time. The boat slipped through the water between others, and if he was seen by anyone, he did not know it, would not have cared. After a time they were downstream, away from the buildings and the backs, under bridge after bridge, and out of the town altogether, to where the river ran between grassy meadows full of buttercups and poppies and tall swaying grass heads, and the brown cows grazed down almost to the water's edge. Once a kingfisher darted low, bright, blazing blue from bank to bank. In holes in the mud a family of young water rats played, peered, vanished. Kitty trailed her hand in the water, and the ripples spread gently out from it, thinner and fainter as they receded, and there was no sound except the creak of the rollock and the dip and push of the oars. And all around them the birds madly singing. He felt unreal, bodiless. He felt wonder, astonishment, pure vibrant joy. No dread, no fear, no bewilderment now, but acceptance, as of some miraculous gift. And, looking across at Kitty, love. Her face was turned from him, shaded by the rim of her hat. Serious, absorbed. He could row forever. But after a time, hours or years it might have been, they moored beside a path that led through meadows to a village, and walked slowly there and had tea in a garden at a table under the trees. There was no one else at all.
It is like the England in pictures and books, the England they all long for. I read about it from being very young in India, and heard them all talk. This is what they remember.
Yes, it is not always like this, but you know that now.
Oh, yes, the rain, the cold wind, those grey streets, but all that has gone now, hasn't it?
Yes, he said. Yes, and stared at her wrist as it curved to hold her cup. From somewhere deep in the far trees, a cuckoo. There would be nightingales here, he said. In the end, they walked slowly back towards the river, where the boat lay low on the water beneath the sloping bank. But at the bank she stopped and sat down on the grass and leaned back on her hands, smiling, peaceful, said, "It is the most beautiful day I can remember. Days like this should never be over." He thought that he would weep then. And as he looked down at her, she looked up, full into his face. And looking up, Kitty saw love, and knew it at once for what it was, though she had never seen it in this way before. And for a second only she was puzzled and afraid. But then what she felt was simply adult, fully grown up in that moment, as if she had crossed a bridge or walked through some door, and had gained all the wisdom and the knowledge of the universe and of the human heart, and could never now go back. And recognizing it, she took it upon herself at once, accepted it, and all in a second, no more. Slowly she stood up. Again she did not ask him for a hand to help her. He would not have dared to give it. She faced him. He said, "Kitty," and thought to die then. Very carefully she stepped back into the little boat and sat, gathering her skirts around her, her back straight, eyes wide. He saw the pulse leaping in her throat, and took up the oars, and in silence and stillness rowed them back, and the sun had slipped down a little in the sky, and shone onto her and blazed round her, and all was different between them, and the world wholly changed forever. Chapter 27.
Kitty?
But it was the maid, Ina, who was in the room, changing the water jug. The headache had not lessened, though the sickness was gone.
Miss Kitty has gone out, ma'am, for a tour of the colleges. With some of her friends, the undergraduates. No, ma'am, with the Reverend Mr. Cavendish, who called.
But she was not well enough to get up until the following afternoon, and then felt the usual bruised weariness, afraid that some sudden movement would trigger the headache again. It was like a thunderstorm that has rolled away, to linger dully somewhere in the near distance, and might at any time return. At tea she said,
I hear you visited the colleges. Privilege indeed. Yes.
Kitty spread honey upon a slice of bread. Her hair was plaited tight at the back of her head, her dark linen dress severely plain. She was not the same person. Would never be.
It was very interesting.
But staring into her face, Florence found it closed and defying admittance. Only the previous evening it had not defied old Mrs. Grey, who had been sitting at the window when Kitty returned, and had looked into it, and into his face too, and seen what was open and plainly written there, but would, of course, say nothing. Chapter 28. In the early morning, Lewis leaves the house and rides, and feels well, strong, vigorous, able even to tolerate the intolerable heat. On Friday at last he will leave for the hills. By noon he shivers with fever at his desk, and later is giddy, disorientated. Later still, before midnight, dead on the floor beside the bed where he has fallen, eyes wide open, staring. Chapter 29. It was such a short time to change lives so irrevocably, and all over so quickly. For Florence and Georgiana were gone on the train to London to be taken around St. Faith's shelter for the fallen young women. They would stay at a good hotel close to the park, and go to theatres and galleries too, and shop in St. James's. They would enjoy themselves. It would do them both good. It was only 3 days, but it seemed to him that it lasted forever. Looking back, it had been the whole of his life. Though Kitty, looking back, if she ever did, could barely recall it. She had said that she would like more friends, that she had only Miss Pontifex's undergraduates, who were in any case older and had their own lives, and perhaps had merely been kind. I will give you friends, new friends, of just your own age or thereabouts. They will be glad to welcome you. And so they went on the train for a short distance, and then through the lanes in a trap, between verges thick and creamy with the late flowering of cow parsley, and here and there wild scabious, pale chalky blue, and clouds of tiny butterflies, orange-tipped, drifted up as the wheel brushed against the grass. It was the most perfect of days once more. And what old Mrs. Grey thought, she did not speak, only wondered sadly, sitting at the wide window in Cambridge, about Florence and all her illusions. He had left a note on his door in college, and done no work at all, and seen no one, and did not think of any of it for a moment. Kitty sat straight-backed, very still. They were quite silent with one another. But now and then she smiled at him, or away, at some distant secret thing. And looking at him, she felt old beyond her years, and responsible too. She was not girlish, had no thought of chattering about any of it to such friends as she had, understanding that it was not a thing of that kind, though she had never until now known anything of love. That had been to do with some distant possible future. She had not bothered to consider it. She saw that he looked at her, and saw love again, and recognized its rarity, its absolute value, but felt quite calm, though knew that he was not, and that for him it was momentous in a way she could only dimly comprehend, that he trembled and was afraid, felt for him. The trap turned into the village where honeysuckle and the first of the roses flowered and climbed and cascaded over walls and doors. Corridors, Georgiana thought. It is always corridors, and high narrow windows and iron beds primly made, and girls with sad faces scrubbing floors, texts on the walls, Bibles, sheets being hemmed in a great bare basement hall, and the babies taken away from them as soon as born. And all for what? She thought. For what? Wanting to weep. In India, the message makes its slow way up from Calcutta to the hills, passed without interest through a dozen hands. Eleanor sits on the veranda and looks at the green trees on the opposite slope, and is aloof from Myrtle Pinkerton, whose flirtation has petered out but who must still suffer the social consequences, and is lonely, and will be lonelier still soon, but rings the bell for iced tea, not yet knowing. In the garden of the vicarage, more roses and beds of great pink blousy peonies, and the children, the girls walking arm in arm, for of course they had taken to her at once, and especially Elizabeth, she was straightway become a friend, and the baby peaceful in the pram. Later after tea they played French cricket, where the lawn ran down towards unkempt grass and the great hawthorn hedge. But Isabel stayed in the house. She felt unsafe in the outside world, vulnerable, and they were used to it. Their life continued more or less without her, though several times one or other of them had gone back to see her, and the sense of her despair hovered around the edges of the day and the summer sunshine, souring them a little. But Kitty did not feel it. Kitty was not soured. Kitty ran and threw and laughed and kicked off her shoes and rocked the baby back to sleep and tossed her hair from off her face, and the small boys clambered about her, pulling her down, spinning her round, ambushing her with shouts. "Kitty, Kitty, Kitty!" She was a child among them. But once caught him looking at her and smiled, bright-faced, joyous, and he saw that after all he had no need to speak, that she knew, had long known, and that all was open between them. And then his heart leaped in pain and pleasure. Then all things in the world were possible, and there was no hurt or harm anywhere. Standing beside him, Cecil Moxton saw too, and stared, bewildered, disbelieving. Slowly they began to walk away together, out of the garden, echoing with the cries of the children, and through the gate that led to the fields, and followed the path bordering the wood, the terrier running before them. They walked for a mile or more until they were out of sight of the house, the hayfields thick and rich and sweet around them. But for a long time he could not speak, only looked at the hayfields stretching all around and away from them in the late afternoon light, the faint haze on the horizon, as if the sea lay there. And he had again the sense of time, as well as space, stretching infinitely ahead of him, and yet of there being no time, and of standing here at the still centre of things, the place to which he had been journeying all his life. In the end he struggled for some way to speak of it to Moxton, some way of explaining, but he could only say, at length, "I saw her. I walked from home across the backs. She was standing on the bridge." He fell silent, seeing it again, as he had seen it 1,000 times in his mind's eye. Kitty standing, looking down into the water. "You see, my life is changed, utterly and irrevocably changed, and I am not the same man. It is as though—" Cecil walked a few paces away from him, and stood, head bent. "It is all I want, all I want nothing more in life. But how can that be? Why should it be?" He was crying for help. Cecil half turned, but did not look at him, could not meet his eye. When he spoke, his voice sounded tight, strange. He said, "But she is a child. She's 15 years old. She's younger than Elizabeth." "Yes. She... You cannot." Then Thomas said simply, "Why should I not marry her?" "Marry? Not when she is older, a little older." "Why?" Wildly as he spoke, he thought it possible, knew that it was not. He said, "I have never known love. I am 55, and I have not known love until this time." "No." And Cecil looked at him and saw that it was true, and that his face was softened and made young by it. It was as though he looked not at a sober fleshly man, but at someone changed and made altogether new, reborn, and wholly innocent. And he thought then of his own love for his wife, as it had begun so many years ago, and of Isabel now, her face blank and turned from him, of the days and nights of despair. "What am I to do?" Moxton shook his head, not knowing. "It is all. There is nothing else. Do you not understand that?" His voice was urgent, angry even, yet he whispered and could scarcely be heard. In the end, Cecil turned and slowly began to walk away, back in the direction of the house and the garden, the laughing children, Kitty, and after a few moments Thomas followed him. Whether it was better to have spoken, or whether he should have kept altogether silent, he did not know. But looking up and seeing Kitty standing slightly apart from the others, at the corner of the lawn, he cared nothing either, forgot it, everything, enthralled to, stunned again by love. Looking at his face again, Moxton felt a spurt of anguish and cold fear, but intermingled with a sudden mad hope and the desire to defend him. The game ended, the circle of figures broke. There were joyful shouts, and then the children came running, laughing towards them over the lawn. In its pram underneath the tree, the baby stirred in sleep, eyelids fluttering a little, but he did not wake. And in the trap, driving through the night lanes, Kitty slept too, and he stopped and laid his coat over her, and then drove on with infinite care, as if the road beneath them were made of glass. In the little rattling train, empty apart from themselves, she sat in the corner of the carriage, huddled back against the seat, pale and moth-like, as the moon rose, silvering the countryside, and the train whistled, eerie, ghostly, running through a tunnel, frightening the vixen who raced away from it back to her cubs in the far spinney. "You are very tired," he said. "I have been very wrong to keep you out so late." "Oh, no, I'm only drowsy and—" But she shook her head, and looking out of the window, he saw the backs of the first dark terraces on the edge of the town, and, for time still stood for them and must never spring forward, nothing must end, said, "Then perhaps tomorrow you would like to go—" He hesitated. "Go to the sea." "The sea," she said gravely. "Yes, I should like that most of all." And they looked into one another's faces, one another's eyes then, and so remained looking, and never looked away until the train drew into the station. Hearing their voices and the closing of the door, old Mrs. Grey sat on the armchair beside her bed, fully dressed, but did not go down, did not interfere, only remembered things that were a lifetime away, and understanding what she had seen in his face and the meaning of it, feared for him.
This is the end of CD 6. The book continues on CD 7.